All right, so here we are again, ladies and gentlemen, with my best ASMR voice, such that you don't find me irritating, aggravating, or anything other than the most phantomly, ghostly, positively ethereal enlightenment that you would want to listen to without the edges and maybe without this weird janky artwork I have behind me. By the way, the clown on this side, boy, I'm gonna have to give credit to her. But anyway, I had her come over initially and paint. I said just paint a clown, so she kind of knocked out something like that. And when I'm done, you'll be able to see it on the Instagram. I'll give her credit. Her name's Kayla something. I don't know why I don't know. I mean, I guess I could look it up. That might be nice. All right, let's do that. Let's see. But it's just that my phone is already ready to go. But at the same time, okay, it's Kayla Nak AI. So Kayla NAKAI on Instagram. And anyway, I just got done telling her because she likes what I'm doing, and I said something about, hey, I've totally co-opted what it is I had you, do with my own artwork. And anyway, so, and I may have mentioned that last time or not, but it's so weird to do a collaboration with anyone with artwork, at least for me, because it feels like there's kind of, I don't know, you're sharing a composite field, but more and more becomes like super. Seeing how you go through time, who you paint, why you paint, what you paint, who paints with you, who paints on the same canvas with you. Um, anyway, I wanted to listen to the remainder of the Eric Arvel and this Blithering Genius fella because I'm only halfway through, so I'm about at the one. I think I'm gonna try to back it up just a few little minutes, maybe like 150, like at the halfway marker, basically. Kind of keeps going forward though. There we go. I'll do it at 148. And so there might be a little overlap, barely. And but what I did here was that it seemed as if, because I only played like a couple minutes and thought like, oh my god, it's fucking midnight 30 at my time right now, and I could really go for hitting the sack because tomorrow is as painful as these broken insect limbs of mine are. It's my work day. And God, I overly worked today, and I'm actually really tired. So, what did I do? Full to the brim with your favorite cup of Joe right here. Mike's favorite cup of Joe. Anyway, I was trying to already pre-name this piece in my head, but I didn't. I didn't come up with anything. Not yet. Um. I was listening to a Vitali and Lex Friedman video. Vitali, I keep calling that Vatalic or something. I forget his name. It's difficult to pronounce and it's difficult for me to remember. But the inventor, creator of Ethereum, and it was really good. And then I felt a little bit like it's too much condensed knowledge to send to even an 18-year-old, I thought. Like, unless they're super precocious, I thought, God, this is too much. And then I was thinking about even my appeal to wanting to listen to this dialogue between Eric and this other fella. And I thought, God, it's so like philosophically masturbatory. And I mean, I think it's kind of cool that Eric said, no, this is the domain I don't want to get past. We're gonna noodle this and plow into it, right? And when I was talking to him, I kind of wouldn't let him go on something. I can't remember what it was, but I kept cycling, like sharpening the edge or sanding it down just a little bit, right? To kind of disclose this leap between the perceived totality of God and God, or something like the one's virtue in its highest apex still not like it there's still kind of like a as George Steiner in Beyond Babel might say on maybe page 308, even though it's been a few days, maybe it's not 308, somewhere around there, something about the wordless word, the gaffes and the clips, and almost like when the terrestrial symbols that one uses to map their empirical and even psychological landscape is warped, surrealized, re attempted to cognate, but that it's at a loss. So it's the closest one could get to an inarticulation. And that this is like one's approximation to death is a discontinuity with all terrestrial symbols that then leap or attempt to have like a substantial meaning in their most fragmented, truncated particulate flying in a storm around the mind, retention and proximation, but like clumps of a storm moving around you at different speeds and rates and angles, and some moisture, hail or snow or rain, and it's this like or some consistency, or maybe it's a calm rain, but I'm thinking more of a flurry. And yet the loss, like the full blowout of one's ego in my mind, when people talk about ego or ego deflation, it seems like there is still a retention to gravity and to physics and some sort of practicality. And I ended up jumping off a roof in a way upon reapproach many years later, like 11 years now, with not about the content of the evening, but more like the denial of the basics, because the language possibility fields through that which is possible. It fields into all counterfactual space, but it also filters into obscene or absurd or extensive possibility fields. And I think, anyway, what I was going to say is that Eric now, I mean, even in these last 30 minutes, when I decide, like, pause it, if you're going to record and stay up, make a fucking cup of coffee, hop online, listen to this thing, present it, argue it, gather it. But it seemed like his temper was rising now, right? Because he is really attempting to redelineate the background existence or existence of relationships, like some latent spot he wants, it seems like, to categorize. And the other guy's just like, no, you're just a mind. You're just a mind that's thinking these things. But the surreal twist for me is that in that stormy mindset of clipped non-word symbology was a type of gematria, I guess you might say, or a geometric and symbolic, like metamemes, or like the smallest units. And well, I'm not actually certain what to say on that, other than uh, that there was also a perceived other entity twice, one shared with another woman, so that validated the excluded middle with this radical alien fissure, or whatever this orb was that was passing through my living room here in 2007, which is how long I've been here, which makes me think about how I'm got to refinance this place. And I'm at 6.3%. I never refinanced down to 2, and I got to do it before the inflation kicks in or something, and got to go through a credit union. Anyway, more point though, to back up, it just seemed like the push-pull between the terrestrial and the celestial, right? Now I'm in Mormon country, so they got the telestial, celestial, and torrential. That's not it. I don't even know why I think that's funny. God, what do they call it? It's not particularly important, because all I'm echoing off of right now is Steiner's Beyond Babel, or After Babel book. I think it's 1978, or I think it's 78. I think it is. Anyway, it's in my car. I read it. It's a great book, and that's why I mentioned it. When I noticed that Chris Hedges also mentions Steiner, and then this guy at a coffee shop said, "Oh, I own that book. I just never read it." And I'm like, "You should read it. It's great." But it also takes, in my mind, like, this gentleman's writing is so eloquent about translation, but about philosophy and meaning of words as it relates to how Wittgenstein approached certain limits of silence, and put forth an idea of a language as public, or a public language, whereby Steiner is arguing that there are emotional, like, he doesn't so much say it like this, but there are emotional signifieds that are not necessarily translatable even into your mother tongue, but they are in some manner translatable poetically, such that I could say I have like a poetic shaped vacancy in my heart, and I experience an ongoing internal sandpapering of the bones in my ankle, or some sort of illicit poetry that references the internal frame that isn't actually meant. I mean, because we have common bodies and we're humans and we speak, it seems like the shared phenomena can be referenced when it's in the external world, but as you mediate it to your organism internally in some internal relational way, one might imagine a platonic form, like a half cantaloupe shape in my heart, or a shape of my kidney ache, or like, it's more like and so anyway, Steiner's suggesting this. He's just suggesting that one could encode like a private language to their internal states, to their organ states, something of that sense, if they wanted to fragment themselves internally. And there's psychological books on refragmenting one's identity based on how many expressive differences there are within their expression as subalter egos, or not alter egos, but just called alters, like not your normative persistent character, kind of like a some sub voice that you just happen to carry along with you, that's like a natural expression. But anyway, his point was to argue against Wittgenstein's private language argument, where Wittgenstein ends with there is no private language, right? And like me, Wittgenstein suffered great pain by choice, in that I leapt off a roof and suffered, and he had appendectomy, open, I believe it was like his appendix removed, or something to that effect, without any anesthesia or any attempt to numb the pain. And so kind of a translation of one's sense data as like being able to dislocate one's identity, or find a flatness in one's relationship to accepting pain as you have it. So as I'm making this video, I'm doing it barefoot, which is extremely painful for me. There's my foot. But I'm on carpet. That being said, let's jump in. I'm still not certain where these guys are going to go. Certainly, these guys are not talking about public versus private language or Steiner's notion that you can peg these things in some self-coded manner that is private or not really attributable to the public domain, the public lexicon. Meaning you can say it hurts here and listen to how people attempt to describe their internal state. But the attempt to embody somebody else in an empathetic state is vapid but hopeful with something like a Neuralink, I guess. But I was watching the Lex Friedman Vitalik thing, and they suggested this idea almost flippantly, like, oh yeah, it'll be easy to just upload your consciousness, right, with Neuralink or something like that. And I thought, the whole embodiment of one's being, the whole fact that you have neurons in your stomach and nerves going ganglia throughout your body, that your epistemology is not like some discrete, rounded out, separate unit from the totality of what your consciousness is, even if I'm like persisting in a chronic pain. To what extent, if there was a digital copy of me that felt like it was alive, would I want to distribute that characteristic indefinitely into its future, right? Although, I'm basically living that. So, okay, without further ado, let me begin painting again, and you guys can comment and subscribe or whatever. Here we go.
Mentally, you can look into that. But
yeah, I could.
I want to get to the philosophical stuff, because there are many reasons why
let me just.
Okay, it's useful in a bunch of different ways. You need to stop moving to a bunch of different topics and let us.
I'm just giving my perspective. Yeah. Look, I'm explaining why I don't have to accept.
I don't want to move on to a bunch of different topics.
How am I moving on?
Examine all the implications of a given case.
I'm explaining. How am I moving on from something? We're talking about the Platonic realm, the gene.
Mathematical system, because the core problem with it, why Platonic realism is useful as opposed to nominalism, we haven't addressed. We haven't gotten to the core of it. We have to go back there.
We've been talking about it the whole time. But I'm saying your notion of the Platonic realm of forms is, you could just call it the space of possible representations that a human mind is capable of.
But what about the question? I agree with that formalization up until the human mind. It's the set of possible representations that the mind could come up with. Because that is exhaustive of the realm of forms. What are possible representations entertainable by mind in general, not just human minds?
But we'll only ever get the ones that we're capable of, right? So from our perspective, whatever the Platonic realm of forms, whether it exists, doesn't, whatever, it doesn't really matter, right? You're talking about genes, whether it's genes, chess games, milk in the fridge, whatever. We're talking about mental representations in our minds. And you're saying, where does this abstract notion of the gene exist?
Speaking of representations in minds, this painting, I was going to move to oil. My oils are in my vehicle, and it's too far away and too painful and time-consuming to do. So I thought to get and then to lay them all out when I have all my acrylics here. So even though I'm ready to move this thing into an oil background now that I've got the acrylic, I'm going to just keep touching up and figuring it out. God, that's right. I got to do something with this bottom part.
Okay. Well, it exists as a possible idea in a human mind. Okay, so I think that's that's the counterpart to your Platonic realm of forms. You're taking
again, like you're saying, it exists as a possible idea in a human mind. That's what you just said. It exists as a possible idea in a human mind. How does it exist as a possible idea?
Because a human mind can think it. A human mind can abstract the sequence of nucleotides from.
Surely there's an infinite set of possible ideas and an infinite set of impossible ideas, things that we can't, a round square. We can't think that, but there are many things that we can think. How does the set of
if you guys know me, I think you can easily condition yourself to call something like one thing that doesn't appear to be layered on top of another, like like if this, just drew a couple corners on it, it implies a round circle, and that one population could be conditioned to easily not approach a circle or a square by its definition, but as its allocation. Like I'm going to allocate something that figuratively we could call a square circle. So, meaning because that's pair consistent and it's contradictory fields. Baird out is capable of maintaining consistency.
Possible ideas that human beings can think of subsist. It doesn't exist in any one mind, doesn't exist in any one place. How does that set of things, you're saying that true statements can be made about it?
The human brain is similar, right? We have the same kind of brain, so we have the same capacity for representing these things. Well, not everybody might have it. Some people might not have the ability to represent certain forms, but
you're missing the question. The question is the nature of those capacities. You're saying we do have certain finite capacities. There is a particular set of ideas that the human mind can contemplate. You're saying that, right? So how does, and it seems that I would contend that in saying that, you are saying that each of those individual forms is truly possible, and that the infinite set of forms that human minds can think of hasn't actually been thought of. It's all potential, and yet it seems like you're saying each one of those possible ideas is either a true.
See, and I don't know what the guy's going to say, but I still have a difficulty with AAVOL here putting forth the idea that everything lays in potentia. It's like he's going to put a deterministic epistemology over like what I think is a natural or a metaphysical naturalistic. Well, no. Even like he's going to put a deterministic map by talking about potentia, when in fact the ontology, the isness of the matter is performative in object space. Like my arm, even though it's embodied and part of my phenomenological internal field, is also an object I can reference to you guys, and so it's part of the excluded middle field, and it's an object. My arm is both an object and a subject. When I reference it, I'm referring to it as an object. When I'm referring to it as an object, in any case, this appears still to be like kind of a step, like a vertical part of a staircase step that is missed somehow by AAVOL. But let's see what this other guy, how he responds here.
True possible idea or a false possible idea?
No.
And
he says no.
What's that got to do with anything?
Okay. You could get around this by a deflationary theory of truth. This says that to say X is true.
I've already given you I've already said I reject objective truth, so there's no way I can say these are true or not. Objectively,
well,
they're just.
Let's look at that implication then. If you're saying that infinite set of ideas that a human mind could contemplate is not true or false, then you're not saying that there's a definite set. You're saying that there's no difference between possible and impossible ideas that the human mind can contemplate, if they're not truly possible or impossible before we look at them.
No. There's a difference between the forms that you can contemplate and whether you judge them to be true or false. Like I can contemplate.
No, that's not the question.
I can imagine milk being in the fridge or not in the fridge right now.
Please don't move on to another example. Let's stick with this example because we keep on dancing away from the issue. The point of the example is to say, if you're saying there is a set of possible forms, you're saying there's a true set of possible forms.
No, what's true? What does true mean in that statement?
True meaning the claim that human beings can think of this set of things would be true. And the claim that the human being could think of an alternative set of impossible forms, incoherent forms.
No, I'm just saying that there's a space of representations a human mind can construct. Now you're backing up, and
you're talking about a probability space, right?
I'm just talking about a space of representations. Like a language is a space of sentences,
possible representations, not actual representations, right?
Yeah, like a language is a set of possible sentences, right?
Right, and how does that system, and this is what we got to before, how does that make...
A language is not a field of possible representations. I mean, you can speculate within there of a subdomain within language where you contemplate and speculate and maybe forecast like where somebody's going to go or what they might say. But the grammatical field, especially in English, the way our verb to noun, subject to object ordering is, and how it is we truncate, and the different rule systems we have about little things, I before E except after C, and apostrophes, or the me versus I, even with the pronoun implications being introduced as like an obligatory field or some sort of bias within the field. My point is that these guys are trying to sum it once again in potentia, or I'm using that term potentia instead of like a potential thing. And it's okay to say that, but even that is a concept. That's not a description of language that exists in potential. Just because I speak English and you speak English, and you have a presumption that when you speak with me that I'm going to respond in English, like that's fair. But if you're going to expand that notion into a possible field that we're both in, that we're walking into, I'm just saying the referent for that space is completely fictitious. Right? Meaning not that it's not limited. It's limited within the structure and the form of the grammar, but it's a fictitious space. It's like Russell's teapot going around a planet, maybe more like Elon's car going around a planet, maybe. But anyway, my point is that it feels as if the referent here is abstracted in itself, and yet we have agreement by both these guys. And that's why I'm like, well, the one guy didn't read much Kant, Blithering Genius, and they both seem young, so I still don't think they've traversed a lot of text. And I'm not saying I'm like super duper well read on the matter, but I do focus heavily, like the main part of my main focus is on these nuances in language. Like I find these little sub-tensor points, or chords, I guess you could say, that people are playing. But in some of those are like abstracted jigsaw pieces. And another thing I wanted to say is Blitheringidiot made a general statement about we in language and our capacities. When you think of Daniel Tennant, the guy that can count pi almost indefinitely and thinks of numbers as colored three-dimensional gobbledygoops, and learns I get like Finnish or something like that in 2 weeks, or some very difficult language. The guy is a natural human with this prodigy-like appendage of an intelligence, at least, that's off the charts. But okay, anyway, here we go again. So in other words, I disagree with that statement.
Which system exists? And you said that, like, it doesn't exist.
That's the point of saying it's the space of possible representations that a human mind can construct. That's the sense in which it exists. That's the point.
But when you say it is that space of possible X's, you're saying it is that space. For me, I know where that space is. I identify it as
and I think you're imagining that as a physical thing, as an object or something.
Yeah.
And you're imagining that in this object, the Platonic realm, that all these representations not only exist, but there in that magical realm, they're divided into true and false categories.
And that's why AAVOL needs to read Wittgenstein.
I mean,
that's not quite it. I mean, we haven't really gotten close to the theory of forms I would subscribe to. Ultimately, within the realm of forms, truth is relative to the level of being you're operating on. It's everything is forms, everything is mathematical relations, ultimately. But anyway, like I said, I don't want to dance away from this issue. If you're saying you set up a system of axioms, let's go back to that. You're saying there is a probability space.
How the cortex worked, and what they found was a phenomenally.
Okay, so now I'm disagreeing with that last claim that AAVOL made. In any case, here we go back to these
forms.
What is the nature of its existence?
Yeah.
What do you mean? What do you mean nature of it? It's a set of relations.
So it doesn't have so it's not an object then, right? It doesn't exist at a point in time or space or whatever.
Yeah, it's no point in time or space. It's a timeless.
Okay. What is this realm?
It is the ground of space and time. In the same way that, like.
How do you know that? What does that mean?
From the context of my holistic theory. From the context of my holistic.
So in your theory, there has to be some other thing. I'm saying.
Points. Okay. To justify that, most physicists today believe that space and time are emergent out of information. That space-time is not fundamental. Right?
Well,
so information is not within space and time. Information generates space and time. That is Platonic realism right there. The information already exists outside of space and time.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, look, that's circular reasoning. I mean, there's no information without, like, to a subject without experiencing it or thinking about it. But
information is conceived today to be a physical quantity. It actually has.
Yeah, and that's just silly. I mean, that's absurd. But
there's a 2018 paper where they describe like how they can quantify the mass of information experimentally. You can look into that. But
yeah, I could.
When it gets to philosophical stuff, because there are many reasons why.
Let me just. Okay.
It's useful in a bunch of different ways. You need to stop moving to a bunch of different topics and
No. I'm just giving my perspective. Look, I'm explaining why. I don't
I don't want to move on to a bunch of different topics.
How am I moving on?
Examine all the implications of a given case.
I'm explaining. How am I moving on from something? We're talking about the Platonic realm, the gene.
Mathematical system, because the core problem with it, why Platonic realism is useful as opposed to nominalism, we haven't addressed. We haven't gotten to the core of it. We have to go back there.
We've been talking about it the whole time. But I'm saying your notion of the Platonic realm of forms is, you could just call it the space of possible representations that a human mind is capable of.
But what about the question? I agree with that formalization up until the human mind. It's the set of possible representations that the mind could come up with. Because that is exhaustive of the realm of forms. What are possible representations entertainable by mind in general, not just human minds?
But we'll only ever get the ones that we're capable of, right? So from our perspective, whatever the Platonic realm of forms, whether it exists, doesn't, whatever, it doesn't really matter.
No, you can tell, like William Burroughs did a counterfactual book called The Autobiography of a Wolf, right? Or any modern lore of muting into something else, or even the empathy of ascribing meaning to communication with your animals as if they're actually trying to get you to do something and you're trying to get them to do something. So there's some interplay of communication that I mean, if they have a consciousness and you're trying to like grant over this field, Platonic field to AAVOL, then you'd want to add all of those, even though that it's still weird to, like, I'm still agreeing with the other guy generally, It's just that, yeah, it's like AAVOL is doggedly holding on to the idea that there is this space. But to me, when I mention like Daniel Tennant and how he claims that numbers are like colorful gobulets that he's like rotating in his mind in order to do these mass calculations in his head, and he doesn't like, as far as how he's clarifying each number, drawing it out to show its like possible aspect patternings that I guess people try to translate, like translating, like the Rosetta Stone with Egypt and English, or what, the other languages, two other languages that were on the Rosetta Stone that I'm not imagining right now, like Greek and say like Ptolemaic or something. But in any case, yeah, it's like this problem still. It's still like both these guys. Like, and see, to me, everyone does hold a different epistemology. And so what I was going to say is, because I experienced what I think are ex parte elements visually, like claims like Moses saw fire and Joseph Smith saw guys in the wood and Muhammad saw Jacob's ladder, blah, 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 or whatever. Like, okay, I'm party to something that seems like it is ex parte, fissuring, traversing, either touring or scoping or controlling me top down. And to me, whatever that consciousness is has a greater like its knowledge eclipses my mind. It's not merely a characterization of like all language as symbols, but it's not that. It starts with that kind of matrix interpretation of we're all information, data, and possibly you could walk through your vacuum cleaner, or some particular person just walk through them, or some sort of Xanadu thing. What meaning the possibility field opens up in that idea, but that possibility field, or what I call a possibility field, is not the same thing as this adherence to a Platonic form field that AAVOL is like demanding it as a like this guy says, is a not an object thesis, but as a field thesis. And so maybe AAVOL is in fact interpreting things like Daniel Tennant, in that he requires this particular field as something that's ex parte to the natural world, or the semantic meaning that involves an idea of all potentia and pre-potentia, something to that effect. Like it's almost like an adherence for his identity. But Eric has been challenged by my words before. He said that I helped him expand or reapproach or relook at and reconsider his epistemology. And so now that he's kind of solidifying it, he's online arguing it. It's kind of a, once again, it's scathingly endemic of holding on to it like a classical philosophy without attempting to possibly reinterpret the way he has naturally interpreted. Like maybe Orwell's intelligence comes from this particular held belief in these forms, right? To first attempt to map the ground before he maps the players, instead of like, oh, there's something here and what's it doing? Oh, it's doing this. Oh, it's a player. It's active in this system or this field or this topic, or something to that effect. And yet I don't think he's, I don't know, and that's just more like a psychological possible idea as to why it is Eric holds that. And because I saw ex parte things, I say that those exist in a different field than like the terrestrial material. It's more like the non-terrestrial, like the physical physical without being material field, and essentially, so in other words, I believe I've said like I'm a Gnostic theist. Whether or not God is an omni-God or not, whatever that was in one case, and its cousin, something that's also out of bounds in another case, getting into my mind, was too dramatic to deny. There's no denying this kind of my claim on this experience that exists beyond what I think is, current human technology. And then again, I mean, I've only lived through it and lived through it on the regular, and just even today talked to this lady out by my dumpster that I was painting a clown face on, saying, she's just talking about the spirits in her house and who was killed and how she senses these things and hears them, and asked how I sense him. I said, oh, it's like a gematria based on hearing something like a penny land on the roof, and there's nothing up above. That happens on the regular that formulates a focus, either relative to whatever my current thoughts are on either directionality or on emphasis or accent on a thought. But whatever it is, it appears to be a guiding force. And I was telling her that it seems like maybe I need to not look at these forces so much as an enemy, as much as like a test strip, but don't, like if it comes down to self-damage, like pull it back this time. Don't jump into, denying all doggedly dogmatic notions about the isness of gravity, like the idea of suspending gravity. Like some people might skip through life differently. Some people weigh more. Gravity, their relationship to gravity is different. Even people that fly in jet planes or long jumpers or high jumpers, or, people's notion of gravity and time as, like, even I believe there's variance, phenomenological variance. Anyway, I don't want to go off too far on that. It's just, that's how I'm intersecting both these guys. We're back to this long session.
Right. You're talking about genes, whether it's genes, chess games, milk in the fridge, whatever. We're talking about mental representations in our minds. And you're saying, where does this abstract notion of the gene exist? Well, it exists as a possible idea in a human mind. Okay, so I think that's the counterpart to Platonic realm of forms. You're taking
again, like you're saying, it exists as a possible idea in human mind. That's what you just said. It exists as a possible idea in a human mind. How does it exist as a possible idea?
Because a human mind can think it. A human mind can abstract the sequence of nucleotides from.
Surely there's an infinite set of possible ideas and an infinite set of impossible ideas, things that we can't, a round square. We can't think that, but there are many things that we can think. How does the set of possible ideas that human beings can think of subsist? It doesn't exist in any one mind, doesn't exist in any one place. How does that set of things, you're saying that true statements can be made about it?
The human brain is similar, right? We have the same kind of brain, so we have the same capacity for representing these things. Well, not everybody might have it. Some people might not have the ability to represent certain forms, but
You're missing the question. The question is the nature of those capacities. You're saying we do have certain finite capacities. There is a particular set of ideas that the human mind can contemplate. You're saying that, right? So
right.
And it seems that I would contend that in saying that, you are saying that each of those individual forms is truly possible, and the infinite set of forms that human minds can think of hasn't actually been thought of. It's all
right. It hasn't been thought of because it doesn't actually exist. Like I think he's front loading. Eric is front loading his fictitious epistemological field, because he feels like he's pulled along by it. Like he's, once again, it's this appeal to something latent that's occurring beforehand, not necessarily in a causal chain, but it's just it's difficult that because ultimately it's still grounded out in a pragmatic translation of that phenomena, meaning that because you can get ahead and pre-format your language doesn't mean that there's a space of an infinite set in front of you. What's called infinite is the ongoing unendedness of all of humanity speaking language in these propositions that could be reduced down to all conscious animals grunting or snapping or doing whatever insects and raccoons and any other whatever is doing, and try to say that falls within this Platonic propositional decoder ring of truth and falsity that Eric holds on to. And yet, to me, it's almost heretical, in that, meaning for him to, because he can get ahead of himself and then format and put order his grammar instead of just going at the hip, impromptu, out of the gate, something new, right? He might not be good with surprises, or not having chances to formulate ideas. He might feel inadequate there, and so he's demanding, force feeding this exterior, like, communal preload. And that's exactly what some the overturned philosophies throughout the history, from Plato to Newton, all over, just the history of minds and thought, and let alone religious backgrounds, that it just seems like the necessity for Eric to put that in the way might threaten his epistemology. If it's pointed out, it might fracture it, because unless he has an idea of something like I do that feels or fulfills that void, but it's not merely an abstract, it's something sensed, right? That's in a realm that's not of the world, not of the human conceptual linguistic area, right? If it's that's different than where this guy's leading him, which is, hey, this is just mind nodes sharing this data, and you're trying. He doesn't say this, but maybe he will. Anyway, I got to quit talking because it's a long fucking video. Maybe speed it up.
Potential, and yet it seems like you're saying each one of those possible ideas is either a true possible idea or a false possible idea.
No. What's that got to do with things?
You could get around this by a deflationary theory of truth that says that to say X is true.
I've already given you the
X,
but I've already said I reject objective truth, so there's no way I can say these are true or not. Objectively,
okay, well, they're just let's look at that implication then. If you're saying that infinite set of ideas that a human mind could contemplate is not true or false, then you're not saying that there's a definite set. You're saying that there's no difference between possible and impossible ideas that the human mind can contemplate. They're not truly possible or impossible before we look at them.
No. There's a difference between the forms that you can contemplate and whether you judge them to be true or false. Like, I can contemplate.
No, that's not the question.
I can imagine milk being in the fridge or not in the fridge right now.
Please don't. Let's stick with this example, because we keep on dancing away from the issue. The point of the example is to say, if you're saying there is a set of possible forms, you're saying there's a true set of possible forms.
No. What's true? What does true mean in that statement?
True meaning the claim that human beings can think of this set of things would be true, and the claim that a human being could think of an alternative set of impossible forms, incoherent forms.
No, I'm just saying that there's a space of representations the human mind can construct. Now you're backing up.
You're talking about probability space, right?
I'm just talking about a space of representations. Like, language is a space of sense.
I'm talking about representations, not actual representations, right?
Yeah, like, language is a set of possible sentences, right?
Right. And how does that system, and this is what we got to before, how does that language system exist. And you said that, like, it doesn't exist.
That's the point of saying it's the space of possible representations that human mind can construct. That's the sense in which it exists. That's the point.
But when you say it is that space of possible x's, you're saying it is that space. For me, I know where that space is. I have it, like, I identify it as.
Yeah, and I think you're imagining that as a physical thing, as an object or something. And you're imagining that in this object, the Platonic realm, that all these representations not only exist, but there in that magical realm, they're divided into true and false categories, right?
I mean, that's not quite it. I mean, we haven't really gotten close to the theory of forms I would subscribe to. Ultimately, within the realm of forms, the truth is relative to the level of being you're operating on. It's everything is forms, everything's mathematical relations ultimately. But anyway, like I said, I don't want to dance away from this issue. You're saying you set up a system of axioms. Let's go back to that. You're saying there is a probability space or a space of possible mathematical representations, and yet you're saying the system doesn't exist anymore. So it seems like you're saying this set of possibilities exists.
I'm saying it's not physical.
It also doesn't exist.
Is mathematics a physical object?
No.
Okay, so then why would the space of all possible representations of the human brain can construct be a physical object?
I'm not saying there would have to be a physical object.
Okay, so it's not. So it doesn't exist anywhere then, right? There's no where because it's not physical. Physical objects exist.
If that thing has no existence, if the system, an abstract mathematical system, has no existence, then you can't at the same time maintain.
I said it's not physical. I said it's not physical. I said the sense in which it exists is precisely that it's the space of all possible representations that can be created by the human brain.
Space subsist.
I just said
is that space?
It's the space of all possible representations that a human brain can construct.
Okay, and so you're saying like probability spaces generally is the concept we're talking about. You're saying probability spaces can't.
It subsists because of the previous intergenerational network of previously dialogic humans in a mother tongue that you're held up in. It persists and hence subsists upon the activity and the know-how of the individual human entering into not only their epistemology, but the flow of communication and different aspects of language and perspective. Like the idea that there has to be something other than the language acquisition activity that denotes or the language floats upon is this imaginary space. And so if you're listening, Eric, I'm kind of agreeing with him on this particular matter at this point.
I didn't think about probabilities. I said representations, ideas.
I know. I'm saying the general class of that space of possible representations. The general class is probability spaces. That's the most general.
I don't know what you're saying. I have no idea what you're saying. I don't know how that relates to probability.
Okay, you're saying the space of representations that a human being can entertain. That is a specific example that would fall within a broader class of entities that we could call probability spaces. So rather than just the set of x's,
I don't see any relationship there. I mean, is English language a probability space?
See there, he said that.
You could
itself a probability
space. Just define a set of sentences.
Okay, let's. With what it seems, the contradiction seems to be, you're saying there is, in some sense, a space of possible mathematical representations within a given axiomatic system, but then in the same breath, you're saying that the actual system only ever exists in a particular person's mind, or in multiple people's minds.
I don't know. Right? And I don't know what you're saying. I said already, if we're talking about the space of all possible ideas, we're talking about all the possible ideas the human mind can represent. We're talking mathematics, we're talking about all the possible...
We're going more specific than that. We're constructing a specific set of axioms. We're defining a kind of local mathematical link. Right now, we invent this system according to your language. We create a set of axioms. At the same time, are there an infinite set of true deductions or inductions or true entailments of those axioms? Is there an infinite set of true entailments to those axioms?
Well, if we design the system so that it has a definition of truth, which is, if it follows from the rules of inference of the system, then it's true, right? Like formal logic or something. Then we're defining a space of like, let's say, propositional calculus. I mean, I really don't know where you're going with this because I don't see the point, but whatever it is, a formal language defines a space of possible statements in the language, propositions, whatever. And if it's something like the propositional calculus, then it also defines methods for deriving the theorems of the system. Okay, and the theorems are true with respect to the system. Period. End of story.
Right, but where does that system exist?
Well, we've already gone through this. It's not physical.
You can say what it's not, but what is it?
Well, it's not physical, so I mean, what more do you want to know about it? It's a system that we invented, like a language.
Okay, but the system is never complete in any one person's mind. It has an infinite set of true entailments, which seems like anything.
Well, if it's never complete, what do you mean by complete? You mean all the entailments are on any one person's mind? But the ability to derive them, the mechanical, the process, whatever the rules, could be in many people's minds, right? Like
Yeah, but then what accounts for because the explanatory advantage in supposing the real existence of that set of true entailments is that then when we discover a mathematical truth, it's not like it wasn't true or false before we found it. Right? It really was something, and then we discover what it is. Even if that's
we're not disagreeing on this. We're not disagreeing on this.
I know.
It's true or false within mathematics.
I know that's what you've said, and that seems inconsistent with the other things you've said about mathematical systems.
Like what?
Because where exactly is the truth value of one of those infinite propositions?
Where? Are you asking for a physical location?
No, I mean I wouldn't put it in a physical space. I would put it in a physical space.
So what are you asking? You're asking what makes it true?
The idea of not where in space is it, but in what does it subsist? Any structure, any
in the axioms of the system. In the system.
Okay, but you're saying the system doesn't have like its own platonic existence. It only exists for particular minds, is what you're saying.
Well, I'm again, when you say exists, it's like, again, we go back to the gene, right? It exists in the space of representations, which is an imaginary, it's a metaphor. It's not really a physical space, right? So we can invent a system that has rules, and then that system can be learned by many people, and they can use it.
I'm just going to clarify here. This guy's talking about genes like your genotype, saying those don't exist, but they're claimed as a particulate within your biology, the gene sequence, the formalization, the pattern, the abstracted map of them doesn't exist. I've never seen an atom yet. We get maps of the atom, but I disagree with the guy, and I think he's using a poor analogy here that he should be, in fact, talking not about, he should be talking about pink unicorns or flying monkeys or, Russell's teapot and well, not even Russell's teapot, meaning he should be referencing conceptual ideas that have no bearing in the world, instead of saying that, there's this particular, like he keeps re-referencing the map idea of genes when the referent point is in a different domain. But to me, like Eric is maybe conflating the Platonic domain, or what he wants is a Platonic domain, with a conceptual domain and an interlingual discourse domain, a phenomenological perceptual aspect of one's epistemology, or how one's interpreting or process theology, or process philosophy, or process the methodologies of getting through and understanding things, like not just as a personal heuristic, but as like something that like in order to learn rugby, you need to play rugby. You don't just like play a video game of rugby, right? You play rugby or something like that to learn it a posteriori or an experience. But after you walk away from that, how do you reference something that's ephemeral other than just pointing back to like the experience? So the past ephemeral memory is more akin, it's what the guy should be referencing, is that kind of thing, instead of a gene, or once again, like even COVID, like, there's something within your body that's throughout your cells, and if we took an electron microscope, we could agree and agreeing upon the system of the microscope boil that down. So anyway, I'm just saying it's not my preference. Here we go.
To derive the same theorems, or to test each other's theorems. So it's like the abstract gene, the abstract system. We seem to see copies of it here, there, and all over the place, right? So there's an abstraction that we are capable of understanding and teaching others, so that can propagate from mind to mind. Now you're asking me, where does it exist? It's not a physical thing. It's like asking, where does the abstract gene exist? Where does that sequence of nucleotides really exist? That's a meaningless question. It's just a sequence. So again, we're just going back to the circle. You want it to exist.
In terms of the explanatory power of this, if I say the system does have a Platonic existence, meaning it's not dependent on human minds, it's not invented truly by human minds. Human minds constructed symbols that allowed our minds to resonate with this eternal structure, which was possible and true from the beginning of time. If that is true, then there's a way and a place in.
Once again, it's this whole appeal to the beginning of time. So there's this whole alpha, omega, the allness, the Akashic record. It's not like Eric seems incapable of granting over that this is an intra-shared field. Like we can talk about, oh yeah, do you remember when Harry Potter was chasing the golden snitch thing, and he was right at the end, and he almost got it and it got away, and then the other guy bounced it back right and seen what and such and such. And you can talk about like, wow, I felt so weird, or like hurried, or does it, I felt so like wanting Harry to win or something like that, right? An aspect of wanting, once again, is not, it's not like just this like barren stark notion that everything is existing already. And I'm not certain how, like, it's almost like Eric's approaching everything from a B theory, like from a God's map eye down, with the presupposition that it's there. And I don't mind him holding this epistemology in whatever module that he wants. I just think it's like he's not going to come to an agreement on it, because I think he fails to see how all of these ideas, like that they are within the shared lexicon and within the possible conceptual field of human minds. It's not like God shining his light through everyone to disperse, meaning you can view it that way. Like maybe my words are impacting you in subliminal or subconscious or tangential ways, such that you're the center of the universe and I'm just like a symbol, semantic, garbage disposal, throwing words at you, throwing ideas, or I'm like trying to polish the viewer's thoughts on this matter. But I just think this is kind of like a young hang up, and Eric he's still young, and I just remember like really having to break down the held forms in the face of like more just nuanced uh, descriptions of the fracture, the space, the fractures, the gap between this held notion that's claimed and double claimed. It's like, I'm talking about a space that holds these forms. It's a set of X, all possible ideas, right? So it's forwarding a form structure when a description of language doesn't necessitate that. And once again, the other guy, Blithering Genius, is just still like perceiving everything from the mind out, the individual node, and Eric is demanding that he acknowledge a domain of like the stereotypic notion of any of these ideas. God, I wonder if I sound nutty.
Each one of the true propositions which correctly characterize entailment of those axioms subsist. That's exactly the central point that I was getting at. That's the argument for God as a ground of truth that Jay makes, that other theists have been making. That's the basic question at issue. And if you don't posit the Platonic existence of that system, then the idea that there is an infinite set of true propositions which characterize entailments of that system is meaningless, because
you can't even say what this Platonic existence is. It's just a metaphor. What way do they exist?
Well, in the sense that so in Platonism, right, the most basic thing that's presupposed by any other thing is just unity, right? Unity is the most primitive thing there can be. And then beyond unity, you can have the idea of a limit, and then you can have the idea of the unlimited thing.
In what sense?
There's many ways. I'm saying, like, this is a fundamental ontology, the basic metaphysical theory of the nature of not the physical world exclusively, but reality itself.
The game of chess existed 10 billion years ago, or 10 trillion years ago, according to you. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. In what sense did it exist?
The idea is that the most, so first of all, this is like a temporal B theorist view, not temporal A theory. Time is not fundamental. Space-time is not fundamental. Structures, eidetic structures, formal structures, information, relations between things that are not like material objects, but relations between abstract objects are fundamental. And you can have there's a hierarchy of these things going from the simplest relations, which have the most instantaneous.
Wait, you're not answering the question. In what sense do they exist? What do you mean by fundamental? I mean,
this is like Max Tegmark has the easiest to defend position in current scientific language, which is the mathematical universe hypothesis. That's rather than positing like some basic units of matter underlying what physics describes physical systems, he takes the move of saying that physical systems simply are the relations that we track with mathematics. But this is like ontological relativism. What things are fundamentally are sets of relations. And
what's a relation?
a relation, I mean, it's tautologically defined. In mathematics, it's always tautologically defined. It's a relationship as defined according to the symbols that are brought into being.
So again, it just comes back to it's a possible mental form that we can comprehend, right? That we can imagine or that we can have in our heads. And you don't know, like, you don't know that there might be forms that you can't get in your head. You would have no way of knowing that.
That's really not the point of this. You're asking, like, where is the Platonic?
Well, you know, I mean, you're saying there's some big deficiency in not positing this realm, but this realm has no real existence. It has no meaning. I mean, it has no empirical.
No. Here's Tegnard's argument for mathematical reductionism. So if the only thing that exists at a physical level, the most accurate description we have of physical reality is the relation between basic quantities. Right? We can't get any more specific in our description of physical reality than mathematical relations, like many dimensional relations between quantities. There's nothing more fundamental than that. And so these quantities are basic. The relations.
The idea, right? I was talking to this lady in front of this. I was talking to this 40-year-old woman about this 21-year-old woman that was in front of me, and we were talking about how, like, look, every human, you know, like from young, not young kid, but like kid to adult is a full spirit, right? They're just radiating within the field of knowledge and ignorance and interaction with the universe, but you can round them out. And I think like, once again, well, Eric already admitted he's using a B theory of time, but it's still like the border of this radiance is almost like the dreamlike addiction that Eric persists on demanding. And I don't, God, how to, I had more of a specific thought on the matter, but it kind of eluded me, but it's like, I appreciate Eric because he's front loading something that the other guy and I see as, you know, not necessary, but as far as in terms of development, before, like Bruce Lee, right? First you learn the form and then you dissolve the form. And so Blithering Genius and I think have already believed that the ideal, this notion of an ideal is folded down. And so that the idea that, like, so what I'm saying by talking about a young soul being big, right? Compare that soul being radiant to an 80-year-old, right? And then think of the measurable difference just in experience, right? And to me, Eric is like trying to make those two equivalent, as if there's not, like, meaning the size of their soul is the same. It's not, or meaning it's not a measurable difference. Right? Meaning, like, oh, your personality is very small. You could say that to somebody, right? It doesn't have a lot of experience. Or you could see someone that's very exuberant and you say, oh, your personality is very big. But if you're really talking about other people, you're like, there's unquantifiable things. Hence, the notion that all linguistics and all meaning can be boiled down to a Max Tegmarkian interpretation of quantifiable fields is then, like, it's kind of a reduction maybe into neurons and particulates that then tokenize, and I don't like that word, back to some sort of number that has this quantity. It's almost like the appeal for general intelligence. It's almost with that same conviction that singulitude of a number, when an organism during some context has passed through a series of tests that average out this notion of what a general intelligence is, seems still like a type of fallaciousness. It's as if you could be supplanted entirely nominalistically by name alone with a number. Like, we don't care what you are, what your experience are, just looking for this reduced number as a quantity. And because Max Tegmark says that that's quantifiable, we'll just sum everyone up into some sort of reductionistic just the fact that Eric insists on the field shows that he's unwilling to comprehend the idea of shucking it off like an old skin. And he's just, anyway. What's up, cutie?
Between quantities are basic. Space-time is emergent out of basic relations between quantities. But that's also, again, Stephen Wolfram, his model.
I think this is just projecting. This is just projecting
sets of basic relations. No, look at Wolfram's model. Because he has, I don't know.
There's nothing that this explains. I mean, there's just nothing this explains. You can just understand. If you want to think of it as Platonic realm metaphorically, that's fine. But all it is the space of possible ideas that you're capable of contemplating. And that space is metaphorical. It's just, when I say the space, I'm not saying a physical space. It's just you have a brain that works in certain ways, so it can construct certain representations, right? So the space of all possible representations.
I mean, we can look at Chris Lang's argument of synthesis, that basically you're saying that the mind, the representations that we can generate are linguistic in nature in some sense.
I don't think they're linguistic. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're representations.
Right. So they carry meaning to us. I would say that they're a model. You would say representations are a model, and that model is about, presumably, something that we're trying to adapt to. Whatever.
Yeah, there's a reality.
That's the language. It represents. Models, representation represents, just like language represents.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's...
Let me get the point out. Synthesis is the idea that a given language has linguistic objects and a common syntactic medium that binds them. There's a common set of laws, a common syntax that renders those two objects, those relans in his terminology, or relata, intelligible as relata. And so we have a relation as minds between ourselves and reality. At the very least, we are a part of reality. We are related. We have, therefore, as two related things, the same underlying syntactic medium. Otherwise, you can't really put forward the existence of those two things. No, saying in language, there is mind and there is reality. Those are two linguistic objects. The mutual relation between them is unintelligible unless we are positing that they have a common syntax which joins them. There are common laws which bind them together.
Well, there are common. They're both, yes, real. The brain, the mind is, whatever you want to call it. It depends on the brain. So yes, there is physics that binds together these things, but that doesn't mean that the way the brain represents reality is the same as reality. I mean, it's not the same thing, right?
Of course.
I mean, paper. I mean, like
it would imply that the building blocks of representation come from that underlying reality.
Sure. Nobody's denying that.
The most basic forms, the most basic categories of reasoning, the most basic logical operations, we can suppose to have a ground in those laws of physics and the basic underlying reality, right?
Well, all we can suppose is that these brains are functional within the world that they exist and at the scale at which they operate. I mean, that's all we can presume. Like, there is order to the universe, so we can say, yes, the universe must be ordered, or there's no way I can make sense of it. But that doesn't mean that my sense-making of it is capturing the underlying reality of it.
I mean, your mind being a part of reality must, at all scales, be operating according to laws of nature. The idea, though, is that some of these laws can be totally like human dimensions, like the game of chess. Meaning,
well, let me just use an analogy to sort of clear up potential confusion. A computer works according to the laws of physics, right? Mm-hmm. Does that mean that a computer knows the laws of physics? Does that mean that the computer has in it the laws of physics because it's made out of silicon and it works according to the laws of physics?
The interesting question is, does it mean that a computer, given enough, I mean, if you believe that computers could have intelligence, like true intelligence, given enough intelligence, it could derive the laws of physics because it is subject to them?
Well, it may be able to derive them because from data about the world, if it can conduct experiments and all that stuff, it may be able to derive a representation of its underlying reality. But it's deriving a representation of its underlying reality. The point is, just because it is a physical object does not mean that it has explicit knowledge of the laws of physics, right? And like a rabbit does not have explicit knowledge of the laws of physics. Its brain is made out of matter. It
does. I wouldn't say that it would, but the idea is that every mental operation is according with physical law, of course. Every mental operation is in accordance with law, but it's not necessarily a ubiquitous phenomenon. Like mental laws or habits that we are talking about at a high level are not necessarily universal. Like a rabbit might care about reproducing, but that drive to reproduce is not universal for all beings, right? There are some beings that are real that don't have a drive to reproduce, but they're going down further.
Nothing has a drive to reproduce, but that's a separate thing.
So there are different levels of how fundamental the laws that an organism or a computer are living by get, and the most basic laws are going to be those basic categories, logical operations. I mean, fundamentally, like the set. The idea of a basic set, a unity, accountability, like these sorts of Aristotelian categories, like there are different ways, or the Kantian categories of understanding, like these most basic kinds of relations are going to be closer to the fundamental laws of physics than like high level very particular processes, like what you do when you're blacksmithing, what you do when you're playing a piano. Like these things are not universal, but they're very basic mental things that get closer, that therefore are more universal as phenomena.
Well, they're getting closer. They're universal to the brains that have them, and they're getting closer to the basic operations of the brains. But that doesn't mean that reality consists of logical calculations or propositions. So that's where you're making a leap.
Well, yeah, and I would say that I logically derive that conclusion. I'm not saying that it's a logical entailment.
In the brain,
I'm looking at this as like reasoning about why we might suppose that the forms of mental representations that we have are actually reflective of the underlying reality. Is this relation of law, the particular law of the human mind versus the fundamental law? There seems to be a continuum.
I can give you
less universal and more
okay, he's going to say less universal, more particulates, I suppose. But well, once again, I wish that he would read Wittgenstein, read the Tractatus Logos Philosophicus, and then read the Philosophical Investigations. They're both fairly short works. And I think that itself would be kind of like a spatula under Eric's pancake, right? Like Eric's got this whole thing baked out that maybe like there has to be some form of dislocation. Otherwise, once again, I mean, I don't think Langen's made any major headway. Like he hasn't convinced me. My theology still rests on my visual evidence. It's not some sort of gameplay between dichotomies of the up-downness, the in-outness, or the difference synthesized, the different sameness, togetherness, like combinatorial word that just kind of like is shortcut, like let me twist the balloon here and say the synthesis of all difference, right? Because then like you guys are talking about mind or possibility and saying, oh yeah, in some way those are the same. Sure, it's only because you can potentially wrap a category around it, but how do you wrap a mind idea with, oh, the left turd? I'm talking about the left turd, and then somehow map that to some like high ideal non-profane abstract, maybe mathematical object. It's like the idea of trying to synthesize all the possible domains of commonality between like an unfinished math proof and the left turd, whatever that phrase means, right? I think the attempt at trying to clarify first the left turd as like a proposition, a prepositional state in language relative to an object state is still can be considered a closed proposition that I think Langen himself then would just reduce, well, both English and then say that's the category, right? Like how else do we generalize an associated category? And my point is Langen can, like Derrida attempted to do the same thing. Wittgenstein attempted to do the same thing. Video games are almost like an introduction of representation within a proclaimed space that would show like a synthesis within a domain, like as a representational domain. But it's just and so like he might hate Derrida because once again Jordan B. Peterson hates the postmodernists, but really that's Langen's just playing this twist off game. And then I mean I really like how he laid out the text. I really like what he went into, and it has a convincibility to it, but it doesn't mean that it's covering all aspects of all possible states. It relies on the idea of, like this guy said, right? Like the syntax and what the referent of the syntax are two different things, right? The reality and the syntax are not the same because there's a perceived isomorphism or like a fettering out reduction to specific categories that then you can put in a common field. That's like it's like I don't know, trying to add a bunch of steel marbles to a gumdrop machine, right? You're trying to take something that's like gooey and whatnot and solidify it with something else, or say the gumdrops are equivalent to like metal balls or something. It's just not put together in that fashion. And so now Eric's going to go on this other universal versus particulate thing, I imagine, just to once again joculate the dichotomy and then find a preference on one side of it.
Universal laws. Like there are things that we identify that any thinking being would identify necessarily, the subject-object relationship, something that basic. You can't really omit that and still have cognitive processing. That means probably not. Therefore, will be more universal.
Well, probably not, but we don't know. But here, look, there's important. I mean, I can give you a reason why they're not going to be the same. Because there's a huge difference between a brain and objective reality, right? Like a brain has to represent reality using the information that it gathers from its own body surface, from its eyes, ears, and it has to act in the world locally. Like a brain might have to, calculate the trajectory of something falling to avoid getting hit by it or whatever. The universe doesn't have to calculate from a position of limited knowledge. It just happens, right? Like the calculation might just be built into every particle of the universe or whatever. Okay,
if that's the case, if it's holographic, then
I'm not saying it's holographic. I'm just saying that there is a big difference between a brain, which is very limited, and the universe, right? Like it's very hard to calculate. Like for example, the three body problem. We have these laws of motion, but we can't actually use them to calculate the motion of more than two bodies in space, like precisely, because we are limited. That doesn't mean nature can't generate the motions, right? Nature's generating the motions all the time. We've extracted this knowledge. Okay, there are these laws, but to actually,
this contention is not addressing the point that I was making. So finite beings are limited in that the extension of application of the basic order of reality is finite, whereas reality itself is fully extensive. All of its potentialities are actualized. There's no limit.
So now he's just dogmatically claiming this is the case, saying this is my ground, right? And the Wittgenstein gets this. Once you reach the ground, that's where you're at, right? And, and so this is Eric's ground. He's just going to now state it and reiterate the case as the ground. He's not going to think that, let's say, there's a pluricity of equal and like an indefinite amount of equally powerful gods that stem out, let's say, from the earth, like the petals on a dandelion, right? And that they're all there, right? Because he would then sum this difference as a singular, once again, one thing, and then the attributes, right? It's like an appeal to the consistency and the persistency, and then using one's logic to speculate and create and develop a mental architecture of what must be in their mind. But the referent doesn't bear out, meaning it's all still just ideologic apex field mind goo, or idealism mind goo. It's like Eric can just say this, and a lot of pre-sub Christians will start with like, well, how do you explain the uniformity of nature? How do you explain the persistence of thing? But because you see a problem and they see a problem, they say this is the solution. The solution is X. It doesn't mean you have to agree that the solution is X just because you agree with the problem, right? They're busy trying to unfold it and say it must be this way, as if their Sherlock senses have reduced it and they've come to this, and there must be no more argument on the matter. It's uncontentious. They believe it uncontentious. And so he's reiterating it without actually saying it.
On reality as a whole with respect to its own laws. Its own laws are everywhere. It doesn't have to figure them out. It doesn't have to discover new laws through experience. It has it already. So individual beings are finite and limited and have to work with limited information. But I'm not pointing to that.
Another example would be the map. There's a reason why the map is not the same as a city, right? When it has to be different. It has to fit in your pocket, or these days on your smartphone. It has to be useful for you, and so it cannot be the same as the city. In fact, it's radically different, profoundly different. So there's no reason to suppose that representations would be like reality, except
no. Look at your map example more closely. I mean, why is it possible for a map to represent terrain? Because the basic properties of the map are the same. relation between points, like the geometry of, you just scale up the geometry of
Not even
relation.
that, though. You don't have to scale it up, because a lot of subway maps are totally not scaling up spatial relationships. They're scaling up.
That's fine, but they have the basic properties that like govern relation in space, right?
They have abstracted. They have abstracted certain, relationships, if we can call it that, right? Pattern, form. They have abstracted a certain form.
The map is abstracted. The map has those attributes.
No, it has abstracted them, because it does not have the street. It has abstraction of the street.
Abstraction is a mental process. Maps don't have.
Well, a map is an abstraction. Abstraction means that it does not that it's a representation, and that it contains less information than what it represents. It filters out information.
Okay.
Obviously, the map contains vastly less information than the city.
Sure. Right. But the reason it works as a map is that the kind of information it has operates according to the same basic categories of relation that subsist in the material world. Right? It's not totally disconnected. The map
I'm not saying it's totally disconnected, but they're very different things.
I'm not saying that the mind is totally disconnected from reality. I'm saying the relation between a map and the rest of the world is kind of apt. I agree with that metaphor for the most part. I don't think it's perfect, but the idea is that the map, at its core, what does it actually consist of? A set of relations. And the nature of those relations is governed by a kind of law, geometrical law, whatever. And so is the material world. And my point is that the most fundamental
When you say that, though, you're comparing one representation to another.
Yes.
You're not comparing the map to reality, right? So you can't compare the map to reality, right?
Yeah, this is within the context of the metaphor.
Well, sure, but the point. Well, you sort of jumped out of the metaphor, though. That's the point. That
No, I took your metaphor, which is the map to the terrain. I said I agree with that. Let's map the relations. Let's map the relations. Me being the map and reality being the terrain.
you said that.
I'm saying a parallel metaphor to your map terrain metaphor. And in mine, it is me or you and underlying reality.
There must be some common element between them, or at least that the map must represent reality in some way that is functional for human action. Okay, like the subway, it's just the stops and the connections. So this whatever reality is, the map is not independent of it. But that doesn't mean that reality is a map. Okay, it's not made out of paper. It doesn't have the properties of the map. It's not a flat surface. The roads are different colors, right? So you can't just say because brains are physical objects and they have to work in the physical world that the real world is propositional. That would be like me saying the real world consists of, like, city consists of colored lines on a piece of paper. I mean, right? And it doesn't. So that was the point. That
Yeah, no, and you're acting like it should be a logical entailment. I've never claimed that you can deduce idealism from the fact that our minds work in this way. I've never claimed that. I'm claiming that you can postulate a fundamental similarity between the underlying reality and the nature of our minds.
You're getting closer to it. You get down to the lower level, the more common operations, right? This is somehow getting closer to reality. I think you're saying that, or closer to some underlying level of reality. Yeah, and I don't think that follows.
What I'm saying is that the more fundamental logical operations on which more complex, higher order operations in our minds are built are closer to the laws of physics than those higher. I'm just pointing to that spectrum to start with.
But would you? Okay. So my counter argument is that there's no reason to believe that, and there's actually pretty good reasons to believe that's not the case. Like, it wouldn't make sense for the universe to calculate the motion of the planets the way we calculate it, because we can't even do it, right? We can't even calculate the motions of the planets. So obviously,
that is not the point that I made. The point that I made was that there is this spectrum in the human mind between more fundamental relations and properties and more particular high-order relations and properties that are composed of these more fundamental things. Right? There's the most basic units of mind that I might have a particular thing that I imagine, and no other human being will imagine that particular thing, but the perceptual modalities that I'm using.
Like, let's say space-time, causality, I mean, would those be?
Those things, the things we identify in our mind as the most basic components of mind are going to be more universal. That's what I said.
Well, they're universal to minds. At least to human minds. They seem to be universal to our minds, right? But how are you going beyond that? To an external realm, which is something else, which is beyond them being universal to human minds, or at least functioning brains.
Well, you can go a bunch of different ways, but one would be by an argument from analogy, basically, where you look at, like, what is the best way that we can describe physical systems? What is the most predictive way? And how can we hypothesize about their ontological status? And then you would point to, okay, mathematical universe hypothesis. The most accurate way we can characterize physical systems is the relation of basic quantities. And those quantities we also identify in our mind. And, okay, by that analogy then.
But we have an alternative. There's no other kind of way we can think about it. Like, anytime we look at a model that we come up with, obviously it's going to consist of our mental operations and our representational structures.
Okay, so the hypothesis is that that is the structure of underlying reality. And the hypothesis is useful or not, depending on whether it gives explanatory power. But at the very least, it's answering a question.
Well, what can it explain, though? I mean, like,
well, the status of counterfactual claims within mathematical systems.
Again, that's not something that requires an explanation. You insist on objective truth popping out of the theory. So that's a
given
requirement.
your admissions, not dealing with like purely objective truth. Given your admissions, we need a way that, in the example, we are setting up an arbitrary set of axioms in creating a mathematical system.
I didn't say arbitrary. I didn't say that at all. You're representing.
No, I'm saying you and I come together and we build a mathematical system. We come up with a set of axioms. That's why I said arbitrary. To come up with them, but they have to be internally consistent. They have to work as a mathematical language. You said that there would, in fact, be an infinite set of true propositions which could characterize that the entailments of that system, right?
Yeah.
And the counter argument I gave was, how is it that all of those true propositions can be true? Because
and I explained that. I gave the answer.
No, you didn't explain it. Because the human mind actually can hold each of those propositions. If propositions are dependent on human minds, then you're not saying.
That's not the sense of restriction. I already explained it.
There's an infinite set. Are you saying that there's an infinite set of true propositions that would characterize the mathematical system, or not? Are you saying there is that infinite set?
I mean, what do you mean by characterize? They're not going to characterize it. The axioms characterize it. You're not going to think of it by packing an infinite number of propositions into a finite brain.
I mean characterize as in describe. Like a proposition.
It's not going to describe it because, again, description is finite. It's described by the axioms and the rules of inference. Those have an infinite number of possible entailments.
Inference by themselves don't give you all of those implications of the system. You have to actually compute to get the results.
Well, they define them. You have to, if you want to know if something's true, you have to apply the system empirically to get the answer. The answer comes out of the system, so it's true relative to the system.
Okay, I know you've said that many times. But when you say it's true relative to the system, the question is, what kind of existence does the system have? Because you want to say that it doesn't exist, and yet
we've gone through this. I mean, again, it doesn't have a physical existence.
Satisfactorily addressed.
Well, it doesn't have a physical. What would count as a satisfactory answer to you?
Either you would have to reject the idea that there are a true set, there is an infinite set of true propositions which are true about the entailments of that system. You could reject that, and then your view would basically have to be.
What?
I reject that because you're rejecting the existence of the system.
I'm saying it doesn't exist as a physical object, but
I know. But what kind of existence does it have then?
Well, I've already explained this several times. We create it. It exists to us.
If it exists in our mind, then the set of true propositions which characterize the system is not infinite. It's finite, because if it's only dependent on our minds, if that's how it subsists, the set can't be infinite, and yet it appears.
No. Look, I can define here. I'll do it. Here's a system. We have 0, and we have the successor function of 0, which is s, and it has little parentheses, and you put something inside there, and that's the successor of whatever's inside there. So I have a rule for generating instances of the system, and I have my starting elements. This isn't an axiomatic system. It's just a language. Now I can generate there are an infinite number of possible sentences of that system. 0 is a sentence, s of 0, s of s of s of s of 0. Those are all sentences of the system. There you go.
Yeah, and it would seem that we could make claims that, like, at the nth step of this process of generating new sentences, the result would be y.
Well, that would be a statement in a different system, but sure.
Oh, I mean,
the result is just the application of the system, right? I can generate sentences.
I know, but the issue is, how can it be that the nth iteration of the system was true, was truly y, or not truly y, if that system doesn't have an existence outside of our mind, and our mind is finite and doesn't ever get to n? Like if it's not countable, if we can't actually perform the mental operation,
well, then I can't say it. Well, unless I verify it. I mean, I don't know what. Again, you're switching to a different thing, right?
No, you're using your epistemic limits on truth.
You're making claims about the language. I just said here's a language that generates infinite sentences, and it fits in my head just fine. But the infinite sentences don't fit in my head.
Right.
I don't have to generate them all.
Right, and there is an infinite set of true sentences and an infinite set of false sentences.
Well, that's a whole other thing, though, right? I mean, I'm just talking about an infinite set generated from a finite set of rules. So
yeah, but the idea is that the set is particular in some way. It's not an arbitrary set. It has definite properties. Each instance in the set has definite properties, and they're all deducible given the axioms of the system. Right? We can know everything about that infinite set of entailments given the axioms of the system.
There's really nothing to know about it. It's just, again, now you're talking about propositions about the system, not just the sentences of it. Right? I'm just saying, look, here, it's really easy. Here's a system, generates an infinite number of sentences, fits in my head just fine, but yes, it generates an infinite number of sentences. That's it. There's no problem.
Okay, but when you're saying it generates an infinite number of sentences, potentially, you are defining a space of possible sentences, and the corollary of that is the space of impossible sentences. And how is it that there can be a true And yeah, I'm invoking the idea of propositions because the brute fact that you could generate infinite sentences doesn't deal with the issue of the truth value of those sentences.
Well,
right?
again, okay, so let's just say that we use the term true. Okay, let's say we have a little more complicated language, okay? It's got S and T, or F and T, it's got F and T, and 0. So we start with 0, and we'll just define 0 as true, let's say. And anything that has an F at the front we'll call false, and anything that has a T at the front we'll call true. Okay? And I can either put a T, I can generate an element of the set by adding a T to the front or adding an F to the front. Okay, so now I have an infinite set, and I have defined the notions of true and false with respect to that set, and the definition is finite. Right? It's not, again, not an issue.
Well, no, the issue is how can those possible sentences be true if they're not in a human mind?
Well, so there's a way that we can determine whether a given sentence. So if you come to me and say, I have a sentence from your language, is it true or false? I can look at it and say, oh, that's true because it starts with a T, or oh, that's false because it starts with a 0, or it starts with an F, and if it's 0, I can say it's true. So there you go. I can decide. I can give you the answer for any sentence.
Right.
I can assign to those categories.
But before you carry out the process that you need to carry out to discover the value of that entailment, and that entailment has never been spelled out. It only exists in potentia given the
I have a rule for doing it. I don't need to have the infinite set.
That's what I'm saying. By in potentia, I mean it potentially exists given the rules that are defining the system. Given those rules, these are the true sentences, these are the false sentences. That's fine. But how do the true sentences that have never actually been instantiated yet get to be true before you actually get to them?
Well, it's defined by the rules of the system, whether or not they're true. Again, if they have a T in the front, they're not true.
Their entailment was never spelled out, was never written down, was never calculated.
I defined it. When I created the system. I said, this is true. True. We call it true if it has a T at the front, or it's a 0. And that's a finite decision process. Just look at it. Look at the first part of it, the first character. Oh.
No, but there's nowhere in the world, like if it's an infinite set of sentences that can be generated like this, like the entire world couldn't embody the full system. Even if
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? Don't have to embody it. I just created it.
But yeah, but given if you identify like a number of the iterations of that system, then you could search for the answer for that given number, and you can find out if it's true or false. And I'm saying that doesn't make sense if there's nowhere for that entailment of the system to actually exist prior to discovering it.
I said it exists in the rules of the system.
But then, okay, so if it exists in the rules of the system, but you reject the existence of the system and say the system only exists in our mind, you haven't answered the question.
Well, I said the system is. I mean, what I said was a little more. It was a little more involved than that. I didn't really say it exists in our mind because, again, what I said was it's not physical. So stop thinking it's physical. It's not a physical object. It's just a definition. It's an idea. So it could exist in your mind, my mind. It's like that abstract gene. It could exist in this organism, that organism.
It seems like you're kind of giving a semi-platonic.
Well, I'm saying your platonic thing is, again, it's just the set of all.
Once again, this whole confusion between these guys lays on the idea that Eric doesn't want to resolve the problem in linguistics, yet the problem, meaning study of language. It's just it like, and I think he already capitulated. I think he already gave up, and he's just like saying, hey, I'm furthering this model, right? And so I'm insisting on this kind of approach towards this model. But once again, it's that whole reapproach to this potentia as if that is an actual thing, right? That distributes indefinitely, because he can imagine a distributive hologram, then he can imagine, I guess, an indefinite, like one that rips through the whole universe, and it's what's caught up when one is not using logic to reference other variables in logic, but actually use logic to talk about all, the case of all, or the case of oneness, or the case of a unique oneness, right? Like an allness and then a universal allness, and then a oneness and then a unique, necessarily very particular oneness. It's upsetting because it's almost, for me, what Eric's doing is describing like his own personal conviction that there is a space of potentia in which one walks into, as if that didn't exist, he would like fall into he'd like zap out of existence, just go blip, right? Like to talk about my potential relationship to the canvas or to this microphone or to the brush or to any movement, like, well, the space, the logical space, which Wittgenstein, once again, logical positivism, the idea of being in a video game, the logical space is contained in it. And the other guy's like, he's not saying it exists, like he's just saying it exists, but he's not like, I pin it to the grammar. I pin it, the rule function is not discorrelated from the formalism of the actual language that you're using that requires for what we call reasonability or the completion of an idea or something like that to manifest. And so once again, this, like, listening to Eric, it's like watching me in college fight with the idea of a public language, right? And so it's kind of like the other guy's like, okay, language is public, but then Eric wants this special model that includes this secondary potential category, right? And so if he wants to say that there's potential because he sees my reiterative back and forth relationship with the canvas, that somehow I'm in a potential field of interaction, fine, but what does the next micro movement say about potential? Like, what does this say about potential? What does any movement that doesn't appear to have application, it doesn't require the framing of potential to be understood? Why is it wrapped around, meaning by necessity, right? Like, well, if you wake up, your embodied self knows an external world, and so you're in a potential field of choosing amongst a bunch of options. And then you could take a determinism, right, excluding the idea of choice, and then nothing is potential, it's just continuous and contiguous. And the only potential is that one has not arrived at this notion of a specific field. Like, at any given point, you could move one atom, one arm, one joint, one hair on your head, and whatever this potential field is has all this ancillary, like, leftover data that, if you're going to talk about an object in space and potential, why not talk about the potential of one's hair's relationship to the nose, or like something that doesn't involve a human intent that is still, like, mapped onto the human. It's a possible look at something that you don't have to have, like, you don't have to it's almost like a doubling down on the idea of, and I guess that's why they're fighting between the map and the landscape. It's like he's making it more immediate, like you're in a space and you're mapping it. And so once again, this to me is more like Eric's declaration on how his current epistemological module is being held and choreographed, attempted to be injected, subject the other guy to this frame where the other guy's like, kind of like, look, it's not a potential field, it's not a reflective, like, you can look at it, that's like an empirical field, but the idea of what is potential is a grammar using the word potential that it probably has all sorts of other historic lingual etymological distinctions that would disjoin it from, like, potentia to potential to potentialities, right? It's more like speculating, like trying to do matchmaking or something. It's like a guessing game that's believed that true love is potential, and you get to mingle in this potential world. And to me, it's still mind candy. It's not a description of reality. It's a description of one's model where they're importing an aspect called potential that is more like in a cause and effect choice frame. I think that's how I interpret it. I don't know. What do you guys think? Oh, Scotty. Oh, yeah. I never listened to your thing there.
Ideas that people can.
No, I didn't. See, it's always bad. Guys, make
Give
sure
me
that
honest
you
percent
on
on
my
your lines.
videos.
Can you not hear me?
So, not first. I was interrupted on my phone.
Oh, okay. No, it's still working. I mean, we can pause and come back. It seems like we're not like making too much progress, but if you want to keep going, that's fine too.
I got onto some other
Okay, let's look. It's the same basic problem from the beginning. And what I said just now is, it seems like you're ascribing a kind of semi-Platonic existence, I mean, just like independent existence, to systems, to definitions that we can formalize. And you're allowing, through that kind of semi-Platonic existence, for claims such as the 7,345th iteration of the system would be T versus F. Seemingly you're allowing for those, like, infinite...
I'm saying this is a metaphor, right? We can invent systems that have entailments, or we can invent languages, we can invent these things. They don't exist physically, because the language is just the form. Now, you can say, well, there must be a Platonic realm in which the form exists. I mean, I don't see what that buys you. It doesn't. Again, you could just say it's that it could be contemplated by mind. That's the nature in which it exists. That's all. What I would say.
As a potential mental form. Right.
Yeah. So that's your Platonic realm. It's just X is a potential mental form. That's the realm. It's defined by
potential mental forms. Then there has to be a reference of those propositions. For me, a proposition.
No. I mean, they're just potential mental forms.
Yeah, okay, but I'm saying there are true and false things that we can say about those potential.
This is your objective truth assumption. You keep insisting on.
Given the system we were just talking about, you just said that arbitrary system, the one that you just invented, there is a set of possible. There's a.
I define truth.
Go ahead.
I define truth, just like we define truth in mathematics. And our brains define a notion of truth that we use in ordinary life. Like, if I can see it, I believe it, right? And so maybe I have to look at it 2 or 3 times to be really confident, but But again, it's just, there's a mental form. My brain is going to commit to using that representation. I'm going to walk around the tree instead of trying to walk through it. That's it. You don't need to believe that I'm somehow, that this mental form corresponds to another form that is somehow physically out there, or out there in some other space, or whatever. It's just that,
right. I mean, maybe the thing that it's allowing me to do is to make sense of how possible mental representations can be truly possible or impossible.
By truly possible or impossible
is true or false if the proposition corresponding to it has real existence. Meaning,
right, so this is your objective truth assumption.
What?
That's your objective truth assumption.
Yeah.
It allows you to claim that there is such a thing as objective truth, because you define objective truth as does it correspond to the real, true form, the objective form, right? You assume that there are objective forms out there with objective truth or falsity.
Yeah, and the reason I do that is the explanatory power it gives me, which is I can think about the set of possible mental representations and address their truth values.
Well, I have explained.
You want it both ways. You want to say that, yes, there's a set of true or false propositions that come out of this mathematical system, but the mathematical system doesn't really exist. It kind of only exists in our minds, but also other minds can contain it. There's no place for the truth values.
You don't have a place either. This is a metaphor.
What is a metaphor?
You don't think the Platonic realm of forms is a place, do you?
Not a physical place.
Okay, so you don't have a place for it either, then, do you?
No, I do. It's beneath space-time. Space-time is emergent from the realm of forms.
It's another metaphor, right?
These basic relations.
So you think that reality consists of propositions.
What's that?
And why would... I mean, and this has no explanatory power. It just allows you to claim that there is a correspondence between a proposition in your head and the real counterpart. And that's all it does. I mean, it doesn't explain anything.
It gives a place where mathematical truth can exist, because you have no coherent place.
Not a place.
Up with it. No, I know.
It's a metaphorical place.
The idea you're coming up with to say how mathematical systems exist is so nebulous. I have no idea what you're even saying.
No, it's no more.
Mathematical can be objective. No, it doesn't make sense.
It makes perfect sense. You have to let go of the objective.
There are assumptions. That's the proposition which characterize these arbitrary systems, and yet these systems only exist in minds. They don't have independent existence. But also, they don't.
The word existence in different ways, and you don't have any. You don't claim there's independent existence for these things either. They don't exist in space or time. They don't exist as objects. So what is this independent existence that you're talking about?
The existence is as forms, as relation. So every system, every ontology will have ontological primitives, right? There's going to be some basic thing at the foundation of your ontology, right? You can say it's atoms, that could be atomism, or you could say it's types of relations. And let's just shift. This is a more valuable discussion. What are those ontological primitives? By going with the answer that they are basic forms, we have the advantage of being able to account for mathematical structures, mathematical truth, because all of these forms are fundamental and they build on each other from the simplest to the most complex. And the end result of that realm of forms is the cosmos, which is the combination of all of these simpler, more universal forms into the more and more particular. And that is kind of the structure of reality, right? Like atoms have a kind of universal existence where it seems like they're identical everywhere. In the same way, like the basic forms are everywhere, are underlying things, and then particular locations come about through a combination of these forms. And any valid combination of forms, any set of forms that are actually held in common together, are in a kind of unity. There has to be that unity for it to be a coherent proposition. Propositions have a kind of unity, minds have a kind of unity, and those are the basic entities. You go from the very most basic entity, which is just unity itself. It's the most basic ontological primitive you could have, and then from unity, we have the most basic relations that come after unity, like the basic quantities. Like if these are ontological primitives,
so is commonality unity? Right. If you have something in common, are you unified in that intersection of commonality? Does that unify you? Why is it locked as a unity? I mean, why is it this necessity of this? It's like Eric's very good at a lot of like object reference lexical memories about things and items, and yet he's approaching this by using words like exists, using words like space. Now he's using unity, and it like I get what he's using for, which is like a persistent, subsistent, consistent ground, which he keeps wanting to say this stuff is out there. Like it's there, and the human spirit through its embodied way is moving through this datum like a ghost, but that it preceded and is inextricably unified with everything else. And I just, like the other guy, I don't see the necessity for that other than in myself. Like 25 years ago, I would be like dogmatically holding, or maybe even 10 years ago on certain things, meaning I don't think Eric's given enough contemplation to this, and I don't think he's using the proper adjectives or even the proper names. If he really wants to get into this, like the other guy's like, what do you mean? Where is it? Okay, it doesn't exist, right? So he just scrapes Eric off on that. And then now Eric's appealing to unity, and he's given his thesis to the background once again to re-up on a definition of the context as necessarily being like the outbound control space that controls all content within it, without seeing that any aspect or any description of said content is not reduced just to like a field of logical particulates that are existing. He's forcing that interpretation, but one may hold as equally that the one's ontology is analogic because the digital idea is not lived through. Right? I don't just have particlic digits flying off and grounding me, right? With like programmed analogic approaches. Seem like he couldn't think of them. And so he's once again re-insistent on this. And so it is a presuppositional argument. And I think like if he's pressed to the wall now, he's not going to say, oh, it's just a model that I'm developing. It's an epistemological model. I don't think he's going to defer that. Like he's holding on to it. Like it's not only a model, it's the preferred model, like not his preferred model, the preferred model, right? So once again, he's incapable of extruding from discourse, from interaction with other humans and other animals. Communication, not a field of communication, not a domain for communication, just the communication, right? Through words or through gestures or through mediums or anything that is transferred. And so it's like he doesn't want anything in a void, right? It's like this notion that you can't have anything ex nihilo or in a void. And so therefore you have to reframe it within some context of, well, the mathematical particulates at a Planck level all build up in a three-dimensional space that we move through, and all mind and everything is one-to-one with that. But that's a problem of consciousness. And so this is still, once again, I just have to say, like a preferred ideology that he's belaboring. But I'm not, God, I don't know. I like the other guy's treatment of him. At least the other guy's kind of got at bay, and they're just kind of going back and forth. Where, once again, he's going to use terms like exist with no space. He's not looking at like I don't have all the rules of grammar in my mind, and if I did, I don't have all the rules of Spanish grammar in my mind, or even Old English rules of grammar, or even old customs in modern English, or even certain polite idioms and gestures and things that are supposedly fulfilling this propositional field, let alone any nascent or sublime or hidden background content that reemerges into my consciousness from time to time, making like delicate personalized associations that I don't think are shared with anyone else. So it's not like a field of unity. It's a field of, well, we're unifying because we all have a subjective. I mean, what you can attempt to lasso anything you want, but that's all Langen's doing. That's all he's doing, like trying to re-lasso whatever is posited there, and then use really shitty terms instead of saying, well, the relationship between the not my relationship to the mic, or not a reduction to the phonic expression in my lips, but not neti, so also not merely the symbols nor the semantic units that are going to you, but it could be my background temperament, the speed in which I'm speaking, the accent or dialogue of which I'm speaking, how it is you're pulling apart through a multivarious perspective, cherry picking, or maybe not cherry picking, maybe following every word like gospel and not having a flight of fancy of the mind. It's still just like an occurrence. It's performative, right? And so that's why it's the idea of like, well, if you write it down, then the fact that it's written down, not only you're sharing it with other literate people, but it passes through time. And so now you have a temporal, expressive, written objective agreement. It's you're agreeing as an object, a contract object. But the conveyance of the meaning during like even this, I mean, you can back up the video, but I mean, just conveyance is ephemeral and it's process. It's not domain oriented. It's just direct and picked up. It's understood and or slightly understood or misunderstood or rational or irrational or any many means of attempting to decipher or not attempting to decipher. It's like this belief that the mind is calculating stuff so quickly instead of like, no, I just get it, right? It's not my mind calculating. It's like it calculated, and now this is just like it's child's play now. It's like it's more automated. And so because it's automated, because so much of what's in the mind feels automated, I think to Orwell that he's mistaking like the persistence of one's reiteration towards memory or the project of the mind as a space in which to try to free float symbols or demand must be in place in order for all things to occur, right? So once again, it's still the same thing with Wittgenstein and the logical positivists of demanding that there's an isomorphism with the world and language. And like I said, I told him, I said, look, Langen is not like, this is a trick that Wittgenstein fought. And here Langen is he's just tying off, pulling difference and synthesizing difference, right? So he's kind of doing his own dialectic like Hegel's, or the person that wrote that about Hegel, as far as like, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's just any difference synthesized. But it's even that conjunction, the perpetuation of that conjunction is like a clown balloon being twisted off. Speaking of clown balloons, I might need to figure out where to put a fucking clown balloon in here. This is kind of stark. And my mom said, I sent her a photo and she said, that looks like you're older.
Are able to explain why math works well in explaining the world, and rather than just like, oh, it happens to continue working, there's a much firmer foundation for why math actually works to explain the world in that conception. It also, like I said, gives us
math comes up to the point where it doesn't work.
It's more well defined.
I mean, math doesn't work
themselves, right? Well defined because we can contemplate their nature with our mind, which is of the same basic character as this underlying reality. That's the basic worldview, and it has the advantages that I've said it has. Let's what's ontological primitive? Because that's the thing. The way that you account for existence
terms are nonsense. I don't think there's any ontology or metaphysics. I think you can theorize about your condition and come up with presuppositions of thought or a theory of the subject, and that's what people are confusing from like deep knowledge of reality, non-empirical with the theory that you're putting forward. It seems like you're building your skepticism into your ontology. That seems to be what you're doing, and you don't have to do that. You can admit skepticism, as Plato did, and at the same time posit an ontology for your theory. A theory without an ontology is a theory about what? Literally, by definition, nothing. So what's about experience? I mean, you posit, I theorize about the external world, but I understand that those theories are representations, and the reality might be different. That's the condition. That's a weak ass theory because it doesn't say anything. It doesn't make claims it can't back up. It makes claims that are testable, that are empirical. So I say, what claims will be testable? Is a strong ass theory saying I think the world is supported by an infinite number of pink unicorns? I mean, how is that a strong theory? Whereas the point is, with conjectures, with hypotheses, we put forward hypotheses to answer the questions that we come up with. That we like when we're theorizing about the nature of the world outside of mind. One question we might ask is, what is stuff made of? And how are you going to go about answering that question? So what is any answer to that going to consist of? Say again? What is an answer to that question going to consist of? Well, an atomist might say reality is composed of atoms, right? So material is quantum fields, right? The answer is a representation. It's a theory. Of course. So it's never going to be. It's going to contain it's always going to contain whatever is intrinsic to representation. So if logic is intrinsic to how we represent the world, then any theory is going to have to be logical. Right? Okay, and that's a constraint of the mind. Oh well, we have to continue constructing theories. Well, we're going to have to continue constructing theories no matter what. What else are we going to do? Right? You don't have to believe you're actually like discovered that the nature of not the nature of underlying reality. And my hypothesis is that actually it is the nature of underlying reality. And the reason it gives me explanatory power only comes out through the entire network of theories that I patched together. Why doesn't mathematics work? What's that? Why doesn't mathematics work? Why can't we discover all of why can't we predict the motions of the planets then? Why can't we? We can pretty well. Only using approximations. We can't apply Newton's laws of motion. Even setting aside relativity theory, we can't use Newton's laws of motion to predict the motions of bodies in space. Within limited, yeah. And what that discloses then is that any finite mathematical system that we use to describe the world is going to be incomplete because math is infinite. And so there's like in the same way that Newtonian physics is a limited case of relativity, like as I forget what the condition is. What was it? I mean, it might be a good question. Like, is Newtonian mechanics true or false? It might be a question for you, right? Because like, does it correspond to a Platonic proposition that's real? Yes, I would say any coherent set of relations, right? But it's a false proposition. In the sense of correspondence, in the sense if we're talking about what's applied to this universe, like the idea is that there are. How did you come up with this false theory? Why does the false theory work? Because it's a limiting case of the true theory. If relativity is the true theory, I'm not saying we have. No, relativity doesn't do it either. None of them are going to give us the answer. But yeah, okay. So relativity is probably not complete. Sure. Mechanics enough. Okay, but so the reason it works is not because it corresponds to the true form, right? The reason that what works? The Newton's laws of motion. The reason why we can use them in practice in a lot of applications, but not in all. And we can explain the motions of the planets, but we can't predict precisely. Like the planets are fairly well spaced, so it's not a big deal. But things like the motions of asteroids are a bit harder because of the many body problem. But so why does this theory, which is false, it's not one of the true Platonic forms, why does it work? No, he interrupted what I was saying, which was answering the question in the affirmative that yes, it does exist in a Platonic realm. But you're asking I know, but it's not one of the true ones. No, it is one of the true ones, just not in this universe. Well, but how does it? But again, how are you? You're saying it has explanatory power. So how does it explain why that theory is effective at predicting certain things?
because the behavior of the underlying system is described. I mean, let's say there's theory X, which is like the thing after relativity, or like 10 steps after relativity that is as true as it can possibly be about the behavior of the underlying system. The reason the approximation to that theory X works is that the behavior of the underlying system is actually governed by mathematics because it is constituted by relations. Why didn't we jump?
So Newton makes a system, Einstein makes a system, Hawking makes a system, other people make these systems, and somehow Eric believes these are, instead of just being interchangeable, that they're necessarily a refinement and that they actually approximate truth better. When this other guy's point is, like, no matter what it is you're going to say is the system, which is going to cycle back to this particular system or this paradigm or this axiom or this practice.
To the correct theory immediately.
Because that's not, because we don't have powerful enough intellects to do that, because we are limited in our knowledge. We're like, that's the
So we can't. But how did we get the theory? Like, what did we do to come up with a theory that is false in this universe, but works reasonably well for certain things? Like, how did that happen in your account? Like, my account is, well, we induced it from experience. We constructed a representation, and for a while, that representation seemed adequate. In fact, it seemed like it was, true. Period. There was nothing more we could do to improve it. Oh, but then we took some more observations and things changed.
Newton who invented Newtonian mechanics, and most of the early physicists assumed that God had made the world according to mathematical laws. It's like an ancient Pythagorean observation. That's where, like, Kepler got his ideas. Galileo was a Pythagorean. All the people who actually built modern physics were operating on the assumption that reality would be governed by these eternal laws.
Sure, because everybody believed that, but that's not really relevant to the question.
Answering the question that you asked, that's why.
It doesn't answer the question. I'm saying, how did we come up with it? Where did it come from? How did it get into Newton's head? It wasn't just he was like, I believe in God, therefore, here is the Principia Mathematica. I mean, come on.
No, of course. I mean, it's a combination of his experience with other with obviously Galileo's model, with his contemporaries, and like part of it is, there's inspiration in mathematics. There's like someone has an idea all of a sudden, and you can't exactly define how that new idea enters in. But like, we are finite beings with only limited capacities, and we luckily, through language, because language can be self-similar with this mathematical structure of underlying reality, we can inherit the valid mathematical inspirations that gave people valid insight into the models, that mathematical systems that characterize the world. But we are nevertheless limited in ourselves and our own mental powers.
Creative epistemologies brought to you by these
forms. So he can't compare his idea to the truth, right? Or get the truth out of this Platonic realm. All he can do is observe things and test hypotheses, come up with a theory and see if it works empirically, right? Construct it in his head, using the tools that others have provided and the knowledge that others have provided, the observations that others have made, and all that stuff, and work on it and try to come up with something. Right?
And I would say that no, that's not all, because the way that you deal with math and logical truth is only possible if you do have access to that Platonic realm. You do have access to those universal operations that we're all participating in, the basic operations of mathematics. You couldn't make progress on your own at all. You could make no progress unless you did have that Platonic.
Hold on a sec, though. But so the laws of so you're saying the mathematical operations are in the Platonic realm, but so is the law. So are the laws of physics, and so is what.
See whatever Eric's interpreting as universal, I could just reinterpret as a consistency. Instead of laws, they're principles. They're appealed to principles that he believes are universal and accepted, but that's kind of like a modern notion based on populations that accept them or that can practice them. Not even certain that what levels of practice of mathematics or calculus he can do. We just know that the functions are doable. But it's still with this, I think it's just the idea of being overwhelmed by the notion of how well math can predict, facts in the universe, but to mistake it as, to mistake math as like God's hidden language or something that exists in eternally like God in form is like that's what this guy's rejecting initially. It's like there's no reason to presume that God, as opposed to humans, are the source of our not only our knowledge, but our knowledge about our grip on these persistence, these consistencies that, once again, Eric wants to say they must be universal, and that's not contendable. And it's I mean, I get it. I understand why. I don't know why he holds it.
The milk is in the fridge right now, right? But how do you explain how we have different access to those different types of propositions?
Propositions about mathematics.
All about the milk in the fridge, the laws of motion, and the axioms of mathematics. In your model.
Answer that. So there's the intellect. There are different faculties of the mind. Right? The intellect is the highest faculty, and that's where the mind meets the realm of forms. And that's what mathematicians have to tap into when they're at the cutting edge, when they have to find things for themselves. The intuitions, they have to rely on intuition at a certain level. Like, yeah, you formalize it and you test it and you retest it, but the intuition that a certain form of proof is valid is intuitional, obviously. So those intuitions are accessible through the intellect, which is the top.
Why are the mathematical axioms accessible, but not the laws of physics?
Because those are not as simple, right? The basic mathematical is not the extra baggage. The physical laws involve complex interactions. I suspect that in any case, it's a much more complex system than pure mathematics.
Well, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, well, we get the mathematical axioms from this Platonic realm, and that's how we know they're true and all that. But then we have to empirically discover these other things that are also in the same realm. And go to the fridge to find out if the milk is there.
Infinite. If we had infinite intellects, then we would know the realm of
I'm talking about well, obviously we agree intellects are not infinite, but you can't explain that because, in your view, on the one hand, we do have access to this realm of forms, but on the other hand, we don't have access to it, and the access is of different types or something.
Yeah, it's limited access. We access.
Okay. So are there different realms of different Platonic realms for different types of propositions?
Say again.
Are there different Platonic realms with different types of propositions in them? Like the milk is in the fridge, right? There's a proposition.
The same. Like, again, think of Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis, which is that reality.
I don't know what that is, but
okay, well, look into it. But for now, it's just the idea that reality is basically these mathematical relations that we describe in physics. And there are simpler mathematical relations, and there are super complex mathematical relations. There are some things that we do with the intellect, which is the way that we access the intuitions of those mathematical truths. And mathematics always relies on certain intuitions that can't be fully demonstrated as valid. Like there's an element of intuition in mathematics I think you have to leave. And then beyond that, we also have heuristic mechanisms for interfacing with the system that we're dealing with. The reality the reality we're dealing with is way more complicated than our intellects can process. And so we heuristically simplify that information and model it in ways that are, accessible to
most people.
These things.
Most people would find the differential calculus a bit more complicated than there is milk in the fridge. And yet,
because we're simplifying with those mechanisms, and we don't know that there's milk in the fridge through intellect. It's an intellectual operation.
Why not? But
sense perception.
Well, it requires interpretation of the sense perception, but I can explain it.
They're much longer evolved, right? Look, the kind of being that we are has had a lot of practice. Our souls have had much practice with that kind of learning, and we've had very little practice with direct engagement at the intellectual level.
Yeah, but that's almost argues for the opposite. It argues that we should be able to just get go directly to the Platonic realm to get the knowledge whether the milk is in the fridge, get that proposition out of there.
No, that doesn't, because whether the milk is in the fridge or not is actually way more complex than proposition.
So how do the mathematical axioms come out of the Platonic realm? How do you get access to them?
Well, they structure experience in the first place. So it's identifying the nature of the constraints on our mental operations and, kind of symbolizing them. So like counting, the example you gave with the sheep coming back in, putting the tokens down, you are like basically mapping the mental modes that you already possess.
Could this primitive shepherd have gotten the differential calculus out of the Platonic realm?
If he could live long enough to develop his soul enough to cultivate the intellect to that degree.
Yeah, see, here's my explanation. We invented mathematics. We invented the differential calculus. We invented using rocks to keep track of sheep. And so we have more access to that because we invented it. And the totality of it is defined by us, whereas whether the milk is in the fridge is to some extent determined by whether my son.
Yeah, but you have no explanation for why mathematics should work other than just like, oh, I survived. It's what kind of, but like that doesn't answer the question. There had to be an
I think it answers it in the sense that it works as much as it does, but it doesn't work in totality. We're not omniscient. Mathematics does not make us omniscient. And like I said, there are very profound limitations to our ability to use mathematics to model reality. there's a lot of approximations, assumptions, and in some cases just waving away contradictions or absurdities in things like quantum theory and even astrophysics or whatever. So our ability, like, why does mathematics work? Well, in the sense it works because it's based on very the processes, very simple mental processes that are common to all humans. So anybody can learn the basics of it, at least, like identity.
That doesn't explain why it works, and why it works not in explain why it works. You can explain why the basic intuitions evolved if they were adaptive.
Obviously, our brains work,
right?
Or we wouldn't be here, right? So again, that's the anthropic principle.
But why we can extrapolate out these methods as far as we can?
Because our brains work in a certain way, and then we can apply some of those methods by which our brains work outside of our brains, using beans and gourds, or using bits in a computer system, or pieces or scratches on paper. And because those things are based on the mental processes, they produce results that we'll agree with, because every step along the way is something that corresponds to a mental process that is innate.
Not just that it doesn't produce just agreement with our mind, it also produces things in the world that would have been impossible without it, like calculating or engineering, building buildings. Like, we use math to model these things. We use it to model behavior of the stars. At every scale, we use math, like quantum systems. We use math to describe them, and it's strikingly appropriate. There's no better way than math to describe those systems. And so it's not just that, well, it's what worked. And okay, we have the basic mental operations, but I mean, taking that seriously, if math works because we have the basic mental operations, I mean, that's really not too different from the Platonic perspective, where the intellect has access to the realm of forms, and those are already in our mind. That's why we can kind of remember these.
But I'm saying here's a better version of this that isn't that isn't like 2,300 years old, but that takes into account what we know about the brain and reality, and it takes into account 2,000 plus years of scientific discovery.
Those basic intuitions. How are those basic intuitions correspondent to the nature of the physical world?
Well, this is a question, and I've been saying this over and over. We can't really answer because we can't compare them to the actual world. All we can do is theorize about the world using those innate abilities.
And theorize. How?
No, you don't understand. All we can do is theorize about the world using our brains, so we are never going to be able to escape from the limitations of our representations. So
that's the wrong epistemological position, because it leaves out the possibility of just, okay, let's build the hypothesis. The hypothesis I'm asking you to build is, how do the mental intuitions come about such that they are correspondent to reality?
They're not correspondent to reality. They simply
work. They work. No, okay, it's semantic. How
it's not semantic.
Mental intuitions work with the underlying reality? Why do they work? How do they work? What structural similarity is there between the world and our mental intuitions? How does that?
There is no way to answer that. That's the point.
Okay, and I have an answer. And so
your answer is vacuous. It doesn't explain anything. It's just like saying pink unicorns did it, and it doesn't have any meaning.
Ridiculous. It's not the same as saying pink unicorns did it.
Well, it's not
a basic ontology, and it can also be explicated in ways that are practical. Like, again, look at Stephen Wolfram's model, where he tries to.
I ask you, what does it explain?
3 times, and you've interrupted every time. Stephen Wolfram has a model from basic relations of like one point, and then like certain extremely simple laws of computation, and then he spins out. I mean, it's kind of computer based. Like, he runs these kind of iterative systems, and he's discovered through this method all sorts of known theorems in physics, in mathematics. So, like, the implication there is that the basic structure of reality actually does mirror computation or these basic mental properties. It gives explanatory power. We can do things by building hypotheses that include this structural similarity between mental operations and physical operations. There does seem to be an analogy. Just to wave your hands and say,
no, I'm not waving my hands. I'm saying absolutely, without any doubts, there's no way. Absolutely, with no doubt.
I think
so. A paraconsistency, meaning a parallel reason, like, because he's running the computations, and the computations are, I guess, according to Eric, showing like coordinate connections, or somehow that proves like the field in which we could move because it does it. I'm saying, well, kind of like if somebody took a medicine that might give them dementia, and they're already old and they don't have dementia yet, and then they start having dementia, you don't know whether or not the medicine caused the dementia or dementia was just setting in. It's like a parallel alongside consistency that could be attributed to another thing. So I'm just saying, like, humans could be following a certain persistent thing that's consistent with whatever you're deriving from Wolfram's work, like saying that what he's producing or what he's evidencing is like the application of an idea to the world, such that we can enter into that, and then that suffices to justify how it is we came to know something, as opposed to saying, no, these are two discrete operations. Like, it's convenient to say that my mind is one-to-one with the universe. Like, it couldn't not form fit to the universe because it's there, right? And if I somehow glitched in my mind, wasn't like my brain and my body are in the universe, but my mind also would have to fit exactly. And I get a lot. I mean, I understand this idea, but if there was a glitch in it where somehow it didn't fit in the universe, you'd have a fissure in your universe. So it's almost like, and then Wolfram, according to Eric, is justifying this background, possible coordinate space from which, like, base, I guess, axioms, or what he wants to say, or primitives would be at play. And so earlier in the last one, I said to some extent I'll capitulate over to Eric because of my notion of a greater domain, an intelligence that transparently sees me and influences or interacts or has interacted, such that, and I think that's beyond a psychological description, and it's not a psychopathic error either. And so maybe Wolfram is showing a patterning that other people, autistic people or certain people, actually notice and follow along, which I'll call, like, you find a pattern and then you pluck at it, or you put it under pressure, you tense, make it more intensified, or you pluck the tensors. Notes, like plucking a guitar, playing a piano, or something to that effect. And so, I mean, I like that Eric once again is trying to further the top-down epistemology. It still seems, he wants this other guy to theorize as to what's going on. I just think that the other guy has plenty of room to hide away in the current explanations that he's giving, and totally say, look, that's all out there. That has nothing to do with what's going on intercommunicatively. You're just bouncing Wolfram's model and using it as a justificatory element to re-up on this particular paradigm. Anyway, how many more messages do you have? How many times do I get to talk?
Absolutely.
That's the exact advantage of taking my position.
No, I'm saying we can't get outside our brains. So there is no way to compare what, like, our...
You're saying you don't know that there's no way to compare. There's no way to compare that you know of our mental representations in the underlying world. Okay, you haven't thought of other ways of testing, and you will never
way to do that. That would only be possible if you erase the subject-object distinction. If we're not subjects. I mean, it's literally absurd, because we have a position from which we think, from which we interpret reality. We can't get outside of that. We can't get outside of ourselves. That's the sense in which it's absurd, and so that's the sense in which I'm absolutely certain about it, because the alternative is absurd. Okay, now, of course, it doesn't get outside of absolute philosophical skepticism, but, which is based on that observation, however, that we can't get outside of ourselves. So anytime you say, oh, look, our representations match reality, what you're really...
Well, I'm going to disagree with that for semantic reasons, but also with this sense that one can get ahead of oneself, become so ecstatic, digest everything, and put one's identity, like if one's identity bases on reasonable structure and contemplation, and somehow you put that away, tuck it in your back pocket, and you leap forward in some exuded manner, you've dislocated your identity. You've jumped outside. If you can persist then into some empathic, mimicked other person's form, or acting like somebody else, to, like, it's almost to the Fight Club movie idea of, if you continue to act and persist in a particular manner, like, I think like these guys are a couple stuffy Americans that are, like, just talking about this shit is like I realized just, how much mental buttfuckery philosophy generates in people. But I mean, I think it's a contentious, like it's like watching fencing, and I'm not bad at it myself. I don't, like, I'm wondering if I asked both of them to stillman the other one and then, or give a reason why it is they're wrong, they themselves are wrong. So it should be interesting to hear.
Saying is our representations match our representations. That's all you're saying. That, oh, look, when I try to represent reality, wow, I'm representing reality.
Times, and it's totally beside the point.
No, it's absolutely the point.
The epistemological position I'm taking is not foundationalism. It's not that we can have direct access to the underlying world. The idea is, given these limitations, there are questions that we can ask, and there are answers that we can come up with. Some answers should be derived from direct experience. Some answers we have to hypothesize on the basis of other information, and analogical reasoning, all sorts of different methods for coming up with hypotheses, sometimes pure inspiration. And with these hypotheses, we can theorize about the nature of that underlying reality. Of course, it will be in terms that are comprehensible in the language of our mental representations. But it doesn't mean that the underlying reality is not like that. Right. The best we can do is build the fullest theory of that underlying reality.
Well, the best we can do is not to confuse ourselves into believing. The best we can do is not to confuse ourselves into believing that we're discovering ultimate reality, when what we're really doing is theorizing about our representations of it. And discovering, there's this common element to our representations, logic.
About this in terms of theory. Not in terms of this is a down from on high absolute truth about the nature of the world. I'm saying the hypothesis I'm giving is that the structure of the world at a basic level is identical to the structure of our mind at a basic level. Relations, this is what the basic intuitions of our mind and the world itself have in common. That's why mathematics works, and that the existence of those mathematical forms in the Platonic realm is the way we can account for mathematical truth outside of human subjects. I understand your position, and it does not explain why mathematics works. And the only thing, this explanation multiple times.
And the other thing that you seem to think it explains is the existence of objective truth.
We should realize that math works.
What?
That's why if the world is mathematically structured, then math will work to describe the world. That's why it works.
But I've already given examples of how the world can be structured in a way that is radically different from a theory, but the theory can still work.
That's beside the point.
No, that actually is direct.
Mathematical approximation can still work approximately. That does not defeat the underlying example.
Radically different can work if it contains information that is sufficient to work. So yes, our representations must contain something of reality.
Yeah, what you're saying is a total non sequitur. Just because you can use the wrong math to describe a true mathematical system does not mean that system itself is not mathematical.
No, hold on.
Hold on. Reality is mathematical in nature. Saying that you can come up with wrong math and get
you're claiming
answers does not do that in any way. What's the step in logic? What's the inference that you're actually making?
You are claiming that because we can use math to represent reality, therefore, you're claiming that the fact that, or the apparent, let me phrase this differently. You're claiming that because it appears that we can represent reality using math, this is evidentiary support for the belief that reality is mathematical, and that this is some underlying level of reality.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying.
I mean, that wasn't what I was saying then. I was coming from the other side. What I was saying was the hypothesis of a mathematical nature to reality, it gives explanatory power to the efficacy of math.
Yeah, and I'm saying that that's not the case. And I'm explaining why that's not the case. It does not have explanatory power. It just doesn't explain anything. I mean, the world must
just saying no doesn't do it. And I'm saying your explanation didn't work.
Well, that's why I was saying your claim is here's the evidence, and then I was saying, well, here's why that's not evidence.
And I'm saying that what you said is saying it's not evidence.
There is an equal amount of evidence in the opposite direction.
Show me what evidence.
Well, I've given you examples, right? Like we can't use math to, calculate the positions of objects in space. We can use math up to the point where we can't use it. We don't have the correct laws of physics right now. We didn't have them when Newton came up with them, apparently.
That's not a counterexample. Okay, there's some level of efficacy of mathematics. That's what needs to be explained. And by saying reality is mathematical in structure, the analogical relation between the mathematical structure of reality and of our models, that analogical relation explains the partial efficacy. It does not, there's no entailment that it has to be a fully efficacious method of describing the world, and we should always have infallible knowledge. That is contained nowhere in the explanation.
But the point is that even if you believe that that the underlying reality is mathematical, which again there's no reason to, but whatever. Even if you believe that, our models are totally different, mathematically different, radically different, or they were, right? Like Newtonian mechanics, it may, in terms of its predictions, approach relativity theory, but in terms of the mathematics, it's actually quite different.
It's actually not. It is a subset of relativity theory. It's literally a limiting case, I think, as the speed of light approaches infinity. Then you get Newtonian mechanics out of relativity.
Well, you may be able to get it out of relativity, but the point is that, or let's even go back to something like the Ptolemaic model with epicycles. Okay, which was not even, I mean, there was mathematics used to apply it, right? Radically different from the later model that was used, the Copernican, Galilean, Newtonian model.
I get what you're saying.
Okay,
but how does
so a radically different model can still work, right?
Okay, so an approximate mathematical model has approximate mathematical utility. A better mathematical model has better utility. That's all you're saying.
Approximation is not a matter of degree. It's a matter of the entire form being radically different. Like the form of the Ptolemaic model is radically different from the form of the Copernican, Galilean, Keplerian, whatever model. So it's a radically different model in terms of its structure, structurally completely different. And this is like this.
It's not completely different. It's not absolutely different.
Well, it's not different every possible way, but it's using totally different calculations, and it's a totally different model. The planets are fixed in geometric solids, but they're also doing little circle-y things. Anyway,
a bad theory can be propped up with a bunch, like you said, epicycles, a bunch of kind of extra stuff to make it work. But the problem then with the theory is that it's not actually like a consistent mathematical theory where results can be derived. Like you have to add a bunch of extra caveats to make it work, and that's evidence that it's a bad mathematical structure to describe reality.
Well, fine. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that you can, but the point is, it's a structure that we use to describe reality, right? And so,
and it's good to an extent. It's not thoroughly mathematical.
Well, when you say mathematics works, the evidence that mathematics works is simply that we have been able to use mathematics to do certain things, right? And just like we've been able to use our brains without mathematics to do certain things. And that's it. So that's the sense in which mathematics work. And then we've reached limits too, beyond which it doesn't work. Currently. We can't do certain things with mathematics, or we've reached our limits. Maybe we'll go beyond them.
Okay.
New limits, I don't know. But
right.
So your claim that this is evidence that the underlying reality is mathematical, I think it's simply not the case. It is not evidence for it because it does not predict.
Going the opposite direction. I'm saying the supposition of a mathematical nature to the underlying reality gives explanatory power to the efficacy of math. And I'm saying, like, you haven't explained why we should expect math to work, except that math is derived from our mental intuitions, and our mental intuitions evolved. Like, that's the only reason.
Why should we expect our brains to work? I mean, so let's say our brains work. Is that evidence that the underlying reality of the cosmos is neurons firing? Because our brains have neurons that fire, so the reality must be neurons firing. Would that make sense? Would that be a valid inference or reasonable argument, inductive argument, that because we know brains have neurons in them and neurons fire, and we're able to do all kinds of things with brains, therefore reality must consist of neurons? I think you're going to say no, right? I mean, that's not reasonable, is it?
It is not reasonable, no.
Right. Because what we're doing is yes, our brains appear to work, but of course, if they didn't work, we couldn't be here having the discussion. So there's some kind of anthropic principle, which is part of the explanation. And then we can understand that, well, our brains are processing information that comes from experience. And so we're embedded in reality.
But why that works at all? Like, what's the analogical structure between reality and the brain that allows the brain to say things about reality?
Right. I'm saying this is unknowable. Because anytime we try to give the answer, anytime we try to give the answer, we're going to have to do it with the brain. So if there's some answer that we can't fit in our brain.
And I'm saying that is not relevant to formulating a hypothesis.
Well, it is, because it means that the hypothesis is vacuous.
What?
It's vacuous because it is unknowable. Therefore, it is not empirical. There's no empirical content.
You don't know that it's unknowable. And also the criteria for how we would know whether a theory or whole worldview is right has yet to be determined. And if that criteria is holistic, which I hold to, right, it's not any one data point that proves or disproves a theory. There's no raw data, no raw facts. It's always in the context of a holistic worldview. So how do we know that reality is mathematical in nature? It's not that you would know it in a foundationalist sense. It's the way in which your holistic model of reality works to explain philosophical problems, physical problems. Does it correspond to physical theories? Does it make sense of empirical data? Like, all of the possible criteria. Is it parsimonious? Does it have all of those properties? If we build a theory where math is fundamental and it's better than any competing worldview, that is a way that we could know that it's true.
Okay, so my theory is that I'm a brain in a skull, and that brain has the ability to represent reality, but the brain does not have direct access to underlying reality. All it has access to is information of its senses, and it has innate mental abilities that it uses to construct representations of reality. And that's the limits, the intrinsic limits of subjectivity, that I can't get outside that and make claims about the ultimate nature of reality. All I can make claims about are what I can theorize about reality through the medium of representations, but I can never know ultimately what it is beyond theories that I construct to explain experience. But that's the limit. But I can't go beyond that limit.
That into your theory in a very unnecessary way. I have that same skepticism fundamentally.
It's not.
That I
But
can't really know.
hold on, but remember, this is an absolute certainty that I have up to the limits of philosophical skepticism. This is not something I'm just building in.
Absolute certainty.
That I cannot escape from the condition of being a subject. So I cannot know ultimate reality directly. I can only know it from the perspective of a subject, of a brain.
Okay, what if it was the case that reality was only ever perspectives, that you could shift through an infinite set of perspectives and know reality fully? Wouldn't that mean that you could know reality?
Well, no, because like I would have to, I mean, what perspectives are you talking about? Like I am a perspective.
Yeah, I know. And so I'm saying if reality is fully perspectives,
I can't know it from somebody else's perspective because that's
what
not
I'm saying. Imagine reincarnation or whatever. There's an infinite set of perspectives. You pass through them through time. Wouldn't
How
that
do I
be
know?
fully from a subject perspective? Right?
Well, I pass through a whole bunch of perspectives. How do I know I'm passing through a whole bunch of perspectives? I mean, there have to be a single perspective, but then a meta perspective, right? A meta subject that partakes of all these different subjectivities. And that meta subject would be limited by whatever its constraints are.
See, that's what I am. I'm the third meta perspective on their conversation. So I'm a discourse about their dialectic exchange or their dialogic exchange. And so my commentary is a meta on theirs, but I'm not coming down on like a truth of the matter. Like it's not really on theirs. Like I say that. So if you agree with it, then it's true. So it's truth based on agreement. I kind of get where the guy's Blithering Genius is coming from. But once again, as far as like a creative epistemology, like that's what it's kind of like, more like a duty towards truth that Eric has, that he's trying to like forward, I think, and find any reason to presume that he's more refined or approximating truth, when the other guy is more like in denial that mathematics can map so well in some way of showing how it models. Like we do know plenty about orbits and gravities. We might not be able to sense all of the stuff, but as far as like the idea of finding Uranus because we saw Saturn, or finding Neptune because we saw Uranus in a slightly different orbit than the rest of the planets, indicated that there was Neptune. I think that's how that went. And like that's the narrative, right? And then the other guy's point that was more like, well, we're just another mind, another perspective with another narrative, and then boils it down to that. I just don't, like, for me, it's boiled once again down, but then it's parsed out through the language, not in, I don't know, he's like arguing. I mean, it's a fine argument. It's a fair argument. Let's go ahead and finish up. We're so close. Boy, don't we all want to get through this.
I'm not understanding the necessity of the meta subject.
Well, you just, I mean, you said something that is like sort of literally contradictory. That I could be many different subjects or perspectives.
No, I mean, just assume that reality is only this set of perspectives, and there's a big, pretzel line that you can draw through every single perspective, and the experience is continuous through all of them, and you fully know everything.
Whose experience? Whose experience?
Yours.
So I'm a subject, single subject. So then how is that different from just being a single subject?
Well, because the limits of a single subject, like on Earth, is that you can never know the perspective of others. What I'm saying is that they all pretzel together, and you can get perspectives.
Sure. So like you're imagining that the subject is not not tied to a single brain.
Well, I mean, you can't know the existence of brains given your own epistemological.
Well, I theorize the existence. I can't know anything ultimately. I don't
theorize brains, but I don't understand why you would theorize that brains cause your subjectivity. You would say that you can't theorize about reality itself and its structure. You can theorize about.
No, I do theorize about reality itself. Obviously, that's what physics is, theorizing about reality. But I don't pretend that those theories are mind independent. I know that those theories are constrained by whatever theories I can possibly.
That's true of every theory, including yours. Like that's just a basic position before you even build a theory about the nature of the world.
Yeah, yes, this is the subject condition of being a subject. So you don't have access to absolute truth or to objective truth or anything like that. You are just
no. It's not that you don't have access to it. It's that you don't know if you have access to it. That's what I was getting at with the.
That's the same thing, then, isn't it? I mean, isn't that the same thing?
No. Knowing that you don't know something and not knowing whether you know something or not are two very different things.
Well, what I said was I don't have direct access to objective reality.
I know, but the phrase "I don't have access," "I don't have direct access"—that's a truth claim that you can't really justify.
I can justify it. Sure, I can justify it quite easily. I make mistakes. I get surprised by things. I'm confused by things. I put on a different type of glasses and see the world in a different way.
Yeah. So again, what if reality was only those sets of finite perspectives, and you eventually went through all of them? In that sense, you would, or maybe there was a way of terminating, just like in Platonism or Hinduism or whatever. There was a way of finally kind of ingathering all of your energies and knowing, withdrawing the object back.
That's the other thing about Eric is he prefers the idea of a Hindi reincarnation. So something like a recombinatorial like reduction and reemergence through some like venturi of death that reemerges as a pattern or a wave of the soul. And so that might be, I mean, at least that's what I last heard of what his takes were on things. So who knows whether or not that's, I mean, I'm sure that's feeding into his concept here. Boy, we're still so close. Where are we at here? Oh, we're just a mere 11 minutes.
Subject escaping subject duality and knowing full gnosis reality itself. What if that was possible? You don't know. Maybe you have no reason to suppose that it is possible. You don't know that it's not possible.
I think it's a meaningless concept or thought experiment because we cannot imagine the condition of complete knowledge. It denies subjectivity. Subjectivity is all about being limited. Like the condition of being a subject is not knowing what's going on, having to figure it out, having to make decisions, having to make choices, feeling the pressure, the burden of choice with incomplete knowledge. There's no subjectivity without those things. There is no. I've made this point before that God, the notion of God as a conscious mind is absurd because a conscious mind is decision making. It's a puzzle solving, problem solving device.
Generalization. That's a false inductive generalization. You're saying the minds that I've known have this structure, subject-object duality. You don't know that knowledge.
Well, I think that's the meaning to me. I mean, that's what I would say the meaning of. I mean, these things are essential to subjectivity. I would say that you can't really talk about a subject that knows everything, because this is based on a kind of contradictory imagining. Like you're imagining God as both being like yourself, like having a problem. Let's say, could God have a problem? Could God have a desire? Could God? Like God can't have knowledge because God can't have the absence of knowledge. Knowledge is only meaningful if there's the possibility that you don't know it.
I mean, you don't know that. Again, you're just kind of assuming because
I'm talking about the meanings of these things. The meaning of knowledge is that it's not the thing in itself. That I have to acquire it. Like I learned how to ride a bike, right? I opened up the door and I found out what was behind the door.
In the business schools, they have the concept of unitive knowledge, which is a different kind of knowledge than representational or subjective knowledge.
I'm saying that when these people
let's go on and finish this because I do have to go.
Okay, we can wrap it up.
Here's just one. So the last thing I would just say is it seems like I'm claiming that my position, my hypothesis about the nature of underlying reality affords certain explanatory benefits. And it goes beyond the examples that we've looked at. We kind of got mired down in details. I claim that it has those advantages. You don't claim to explain the things that I'm claiming to explain. And on that basis alone, I would always take an explanation. If it's admittedly hypothetical, I would take a hypothesis over no hypothesis.
Did you say what I am not claiming to explain?
Why math works, why the intuitions.
Did I actually claim I couldn't explain that?
You claimed you couldn't explain why the intuitions in our mind correspond, and you didn't like the word correspond, but why they work.
I didn't say that I couldn't explain why our mental faculties work. I just don't explain again, I don't have your assumption of objective truth. And every time I explain it, you don't like the answer because it doesn't have that assumption. That's what's going on. I'm giving the explanation. I'm saying, well, our brains evolved. They work in a certain way. They can capture some of the regularity of the world. They learn it from experience. I can give accounts of all these things. You don't like them. And the thing that you don't like is that they don't contain your assumption of objective truth.
You can go back and listen to this. Other people can listen to that section when you said that can't be answered directly in response to the question of those intuitions. You can go back and you'll recognize what I'm talking about. But anyway, so you're claiming, are you claiming that what you explain everything that I'm claiming to explain, or are you saying that there are certain things that
you're claiming to explain something which isn't an explanation? You're claiming to explain. You claim to explain quotes why, how a mathematical theorem can be true independent of minds. And I say there's no need to. That's not something that needs an explanation. There's no problem of explanation. There's no data that require explanation. It's an assumption.
The
not
truth value of those things before mathematical discovery. In building an account of how mathematical discovery happens, it would be helpful if we had a way of accounting for the truth status of those mathematical claims as they were before they were actually discovered. That maybe.
But I gave that.
I don't think we hit.
Mathematics is a system. Once you define the system, the theorems are defined.
At length, why that is problematic, because you're not accounting for how that system has its entailments or where that system is, how the system exists. So you're seemingly different from mind.
Anyway, I didn't go over that. It doesn't exist in physical reality.
It's incoherent. It seems that you're in contradiction with what you're saying when it comes to the treatment of mathematical systems and language.
See, and that's why I wrote the book on contradiction. It's like these guys are not going to influence. I mean, it'd take a long time to influence the other one to fully empathize with the care of the other one's position, because there's too many like background, just like held opinions about what must be. That's not really where I was going to go with the commentary, but let's finish this out. We're so close still. Here we go.
It seems like you don't really have a good way of accounting for languages or mathematical systems. That's my perspective. But going back to the general point, I think that you are getting stuck in a kind of skepticism where you can maintain at one level the skepticism that you currently have, and at another level, you could at least try to build a theory of underlying reality. And I think that you say that you have done that, but then you also say that you throw out ontology and metaphysics. And I'm saying you can't have a complete theory without ontology and metaphysics. You don't have a notion of ontological primitive because you say, well, we can't know that. Okay, well, guess at it, and we'll see what we can derive from the guess. That's the basic difference in kind of our attitude and our approach to building hypotheses. I think mine is totally justifiable in light of like prevailing philosophy of science, the way people think about hypothetical reasoning and all of that. And I don't see why you would restrain yourself from building up certain hypotheses that you're not looking at, like the idea of an ontological primitive. What is the world actually made of? You say we can't know that. And I'm saying, okay, well, you're leaving a bunch of questions.
Well, I've explained that.
Philosophical problems.
I've explained that any attempt to do that is just going to be question begging. Or confusion. It's just going to be confusing yourself. Let's not confuse ourselves. Let's not know
what the implication of the hypothesis will be. You have to first give the hypothesis, build out the system, and then predict, and then build predictions on the basis of the system. And you don't know that until you actually.
Why there are no.
You can't obviously know that it's just going to be question begging and useless.
Yeah, you can. Because again,
try it out.
Well, you could say that the ontological primitive is subjectivity. That I start from subjectivity. Okay, and so I try to go from there. And so I don't posit things about objectivity.
Idealism. That would be idealism. So I think
no.
It would be definition.
No.
An ontological primitive is what is not.
Well, I don't. Well, I'm trying to use your language. I mean, I said I reject ontology, right? So, I mean, if you don't want me to, I can put it in my words. I can try to put it in your words. My point is,
you're reading the category of ontological thinking in the way that you're using it.
I'm saying I started from subjectivity. No, I start from subjectivity.
That's a decision, not ontological.
Well, it doesn't matter. You call it whatever you want. Okay, I'm saying that knowledge is constructed by a subject to explain and predict their experiences and generate action in the world. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I'm saying that the question about that underlying world, it seems like you don't want to think about at a metaphysical level. Asking the question of what is it made of?
I'm saying in my worldview, this question does not arise because it's immediately rejected as unknowable. I can say it's unknowable.
It's unknowable. You don't know that it's unknowable. You can reason, you can come up with likely theories which suggest that it's unknowable, but there is literally no reason not to hypothesize into what is currently thought to be unknowable territory. If people never speculated on things they thought they couldn't know, we wouldn't be here. Science wouldn't exist.
This is a little bit.
I really have to go. If you want to say anything.
All right. Yeah, I think it's fine. I think we've covered the ground many times over. But anyway, sorry, it got so contentious. I'll listen to this. But yeah, I mean, I don't think you're understanding my position. And I think I understand your position. And I think you're stuck. And I mean, go think about it. I think you're stuck on this notion of objective truth. And what would it be if you could let go of that? Could you have a worldview without objective truth? Could you do that? Could you just accept, yes, it's subjective. All I have is myself. All I can really know.
I mean, this is the same. We're restating the same problem that we were just talking about. That I was just talking about.
Yeah, but I'm saying, can you let go of that? Hypothetically,
access to objective truth is one thing. Saying there is no objective truth is a really different thing.
Why can't you hypothesize
I have access to objective truth. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But then once you admit you don't have access, then the process is building hypotheses. Anyway, it's good talking to you. I know it got contentious. I was just trying to get my points in, not forget stuff. And we have a tendency to dance around different issues. And I try to bring it back in. No hard feelings. We can talk again about this. But anyway, have a good rest of your day.
All right. Yeah, have a good day. Bye.
All right. Okay, well, I don't have any last thoughts. I want to wrap it up. And looks like there's two people there and a couple. Oh, and chicken. And to best return the other cheek and pull up your butt crack. I probably got my plumber's crack, my painter's plumber's crack out. Scoobily doop. Hope things aren't too radicalized in Australia. We're getting some weird news about y'all there. And that'll date the video that we're still in the time of COVID and lockdowns and international weirdisms for anyone that sees this particular video in the future and wonders like, wow, what's going on at this point in time, and why would these guys be talking about this shit, and why would this guy be wanting to do a video with some commentary about some of that shit, and then it'll give you some context, because kind of like the one guy, the knowledge set is still relative and doesn't have to be lassoed by the objective universal and yet you can always hypotheticalize epistemology, like Eric says, is a creative venture. But I just think that Eric is less well read on the matter, and he can't seem to change his perspective on the relationship of language to the models in which that are derived from that language. He gets it enough to get it. But I agree with the other guy. I think the other guy probably understands Eric's model better than Eric understands his model. But the other guy just out of hand, like, no, I don't go there. It doesn't register. And I suppose that the inverse, according to Eric, would not register, just because he would believe it absurd to not make a presumption based on, the experience and the evidence that he's come to know and love. That being said, make certain that y'all, like and subscribe, and tell me how much you like my plumber's crack, and leave a tip on my non-Patreon, meaning just send me money. Go to MikeFell.com, figure out my Bitcoin address, and make me stinky wealthy. I don't think that's gonna happen, but then any comments about this here painting? Those are always help too. I gotta just tap, right? And then, see, even the idea of aesthetics, like all true propositions, still, and with Eric with the all true propositions thing, and it's just like so many people have dealt with this contention, and that's why I'm like, guys, is he so addicted to Langen's thing that he's going to hold on to that hypothesizing? And I mean, there's got to be a way to reapproach the idea of lightly, tentatively accepting that which is consistent and persistent as ground, and then taking and holding that which is persistent and consistent in language or grammar, form, or in habit, or in ritual as a type kind of form held within that persistence, and then realizing that the possible nuanced variations, even amongst how to approach this very idea in certain languages, I imagine that the emphasis and the tone and maybe even the attempt to translate this conversation with the nuances that I would pick up to another language would be much more difficult than merely just having Google attempt to like go through every word and try to do a literal interpretation. Well, certainly it doesn't do that, because it also appeals to idiomatic descriptions that translators have added to the Google approach towards the differentiation of language. But on the front end, it just looks like a very close approximation that seemingly is acceptable on both sides. But really, when I'm texting and using the translation device with like Russians or Czechs or whomever I bump into, there is just the most rudimentary of pidgin ideas, and such that, once again, even the context, like if all is known in this hypothetical model of Eric's, then that disjunction of affectations within the language during translation would not have the same like impact, right? Like if you were around somebody and they were always around people with bullhorns yelling, it wouldn't shock them, right? But as soon if you just randomly started entering into a place and like all day for indefinite periods of time, everyone's yelling at you with the bullhorn, you'd probably wonder, like, the way in which I interpret language itself and the meaning is now translated by this film of blatant loudness and kind of this blown out notion that removes one then from, let's say, a calm ASMR sincerity field like this is. Woohoo, I got 2 people. Let's see. I have only been in lockdown for 2 weeks during the entire affair. All's well, people keep showing. Boy, they're in that old Australia, like people rebelling and pushing cops around and not wanting more lockups. But that being said, boys and girls, or whoever's watching, Vane, maybe Barry, maybe Ace, who knows. Check it in, check it out. You got any opinion on it? Once again, this clown was initially created by a Kayla, somebody that I mentioned, Nikaili on Instagram. And I've just been like refining it. And it's like a perfect integration because I was telling her about, and then I'll finish up. I was telling her about how this tire, this wheel on this unicycle seems to be mirroring this tire, right? So I really liked that she put it that way. But at the same time, by looking at the whole clown, it appears almost like it's just wiggling sideways in front of, almost perpendicular to. So it's like an irony within the perception that how it is one might imagine this particular expression that's lightly entangled and lightly mapped onto kind of like warped surreal tires. Anyway, just admit it. You guys think I am the cat's meow.